to Nighttime Stories. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Now it's time to unwind. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Before you get cozy, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more bedtime stories your way. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. I've always believed that life has a way of unraveling slowly, like a sweater with a loose thread. One small pull and before you know it, the whole thing falls apart. If you had told me a year ago that my best friend would accidentally create a cult, that people would start believing in it, and that I'd end up running for my life because of something we started as a joke, I would have laughed. But here I am, and I'm not laughing anymore. It started with Samantha. She had always been the kind of person who pushed limits, the type who said the things other people were too scared to voice, who turned boredom into chaos just to see what would happen. We'd been best friends since we were kids. She was always the one who convinced me to do stupid things, climb onto the school roof, steal beers from her dad's fridge, sneak out at night to explore abandoned buildings. But this was different. She didn't mean for it to get out of hand. I have to believe that. It started as a joke, a ridiculous late-night conversation fueled by boredom and too much caffeine. We were sprawled across her bed, bathed in the glow of her laptop screen, scrolling through conspiracy forums and laughing at the wild theories people came up with. Secret societies, mind control, symbols hidden in plain sight. It was a rabbit hole we had fallen into more than once. I bet we could make one of these, Samantha had said, grinning as she scrolled through a thread about an underground group that supposedly controlled world events. I scoffed. What? A conspiracy theory? No. A cult. I had rolled my eyes. You mean like drink the Kool-Aid kind of cult? She sat up, eyes glinting with mischief. Not like a real one. Just something vague, cryptic. Something weird enough that people start talking about it. We make up a few rules, throw in some symbols, drop it into the internet, and watch what happens. It was so semantic. Always playing with fire just to see if it would burn. I should have shut it down right then and there. But instead I laughed, and that was my first mistake. The next day she was serious about it. I already made an account, she said, holding up her phone. The profile was simple, just a username. The oracles await. The banner was a grainy black and white image of a group of faceless figures standing in a circle. No way, I said, shaking my head. She tossed her phone at me. Read it. I skimmed the first post. It was short, just a paragraph. We were never meant to know the truth. The oracles await those who seek beyond the veil. Watch, listen, follow the signs. What does that even mean? I asked. That's the point, she said, beaming. It sounds like it means something. It was nonsense, but it felt like something deeper, like one of those cryptic riddles you see in online scavenger hunts designed to pull people in. Before I could argue, she was already typing out another post. The first step is understanding that nothing is coincidence. The second step is seeing what has always been there. Step 3. You already know. She hit post before I could protest. It's stupid, I said, tossing her phone back. She grinned. Yeah, but stupid things get people's attention. And once again I let it slide. That was my second mistake. It started small. A few likes. A couple of comments from people who clearly thought it was some kind of ARG, alternate reality game. People loved this kind of stuff. Puzzles, cryptic messages, the thrill of thinking they were discovering something hidden. Samantha leaned into it. She started responding to comments with vague, unsettling messages. Someone would ask, "What are the oracles?" and she'd reply, "They were watching before you even asked this question." Another person wrote, "This is fake, right?" Samantha's response, "Fake is just another word for unseen." People ate it up. I watched with a mix of amusement and unease as the account grew. Hundreds of followers turned into thousands. Soon, people were arguing in the comments, trying to decode her riddles, dissecting every sentence, searching for meaning where there was none. And then the submission started. People began sending photos, weird symbols drawn in notebooks, cryptic messages scrawled on walls, recordings of distorted voices. They weren't just following the hoax. They were becoming a part of it. That's when the first package arrived. I was at Samantha's apartment when she found it. A plain cardboard box, no return address, sitting on her doorstep like it had been left there by hand. Inside was a notebook. The pages were filled with handwritten symbols, drawings of eyes, lists of numbers arranged in strange sequences. At the very back was a note. It wasn't signed. Just a single sentence. "Thank you for showing us the way." Samantha laughed. "I didn't. This is getting weird," I said. She waved me off. "It's harmless." I wasn't so sure, because for the first time, I started to wonder, what if someone really believes this? I started distancing myself. Samantha was obsessed now. She spent hours online, engaging with followers, dropping cryptic clues, watching as people scrambled to make sense of it all. Meanwhile, I tried to focus on real life. Work, friends. Jordan had been patient with me. He'd listened to me ramble about the whole thing when it was still funny. But one night, as we sat on his couch, he sighed and looked me straight in the eyes. "Thing with Samantha, you need to let it go," he said. "It's not just a joke anymore." I wanted to believe he was wrong. But then the second package arrived. Samantha found it on my doorstep this time. Another notebook. Another cryptic message. But this time, there was a Polaroid. A blurry photo of me, walking home, taken from behind. A chill crept up my spine. "This isn't funny anymore," I told her. She frowned. "Elliot, I didn't send this." I believed her, which meant that someone else did. Someone who was watching. Someone who believed. And that's when I realized the oracles weren't just an idea anymore. They were real. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that Polaroid. The grainy image of me walking home, my back turned, completely unaware. It wasn't the idea of being watched that scared me the most. It was the implication. Someone had been close enough to take a picture, to follow me without me noticing. And whoever they weren't just lurking online anymore. They were here. I kept checking my phone, waiting for another post, another message, some kind of update from Samantha. But she was unusually quiet. Normally she'd be texting me every hour with new developments, laughing about the latest weird submission someone had sent. That night, nothing. By the time morning rolled around, I was exhausted. The logical part of my brain told me I was overreacting, that this was just a stupid internet game that had gone too far. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. I needed to talk to her in person. When I got to her apartment, the door was unlocked. I hesitated, my fingers resting on the doorknob. Samantha never left her door unlocked, ever. I pushed it open. Inside, the place was a mess, not the usual Samantha chaos of coffee cups and scattered notebooks. This was different. The couch cushions were on the floor, the desk chair knocked over. Papers were strewn everywhere. And her laptop was open. The screen was black, but when I touched the trackpad, the screen flickered to life. The browser was already pulled up to the Oracle's page, and there was a new post. But it wasn't from Samantha. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting into knots. "A third step is understanding that you were never in control." There was a photo attached of Samantha. She was sitting on her bed, staring at the camera, eyes wide, not smiling, not posing, just staring. The timestamp was from this morning. My skin prickled. I turned slowly, scanning the apartment, half expecting someone to still be here, but it was empty. The silence was so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. I reached for my phone and dialed her number. It rang once, twice, then a voice answered. But it wasn't Samantha. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, a whisper crackled through the speaker. "He doesn't need this name anymore." I dropped the phone. I didn't pick it back up. I just ran. I drove straight to Jordan's apartment, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. I must have looked insane when he opened the door because his whole expression shifted. "Elliot, what's wrong?" I pushed past him, slamming the door behind me. "She's gone." His brows furrowed. "Who?" "Samantha." My voice came out breathless. Someone took her. Or she left. I don't know." Jordan frowned. "Elliot, slow down." I shook my head. "No, you don't understand. She didn't just leave. Someone was in her apartment. Someone posted from her account. And I swallowed, trying to get my thoughts straight. "They answered her phone." Jordan stared at me for a long moment. Then, without a word, he walked to his kitchen counter, grabbed his keys and his jacket. "Let's go." We went to the police. I told them everything. How Samantha started the Oracle's account, how people had latched onto it, how it had spiraled into something we couldn't control. I showed them the Polaroid. I showed them the message from her account, the eerie post with the timestamp after she had already gone missing. I even played them the phone call, and the officer just frowned. "She's an adult," he said. "There's no sign of a struggle. Maybe she just left." I felt like I was going to be sick. "She wouldn't leave," I said, voice sharp. "And what about the message, the phone call?" The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, we'll check into it, but there's no evidence of foul play. If you hear from her, let us know." I wanted to scream, but Jordan grabbed my arm before I could. "Come on," he said under his breath. I clenched my jaw, but I followed him outside. We got back into the car, and for a long time we just sat there in silence. Then Jordan spoke. "If the cops aren't going to do anything," he said, voice steady, "then we will." We started digging. We went through every post on the Oracle's account, looking for patterns, messages, anything that stood out. And we found something. A list of numbers, buried in an old post from months ago. At first it looked random, but when Jordan ran it through a basic cipher decoder, the numbers spelled out an address. It was in a town 2 hours away. We didn't think. We just drove. The whole way there, my mind raced. Who had been following us? Was Samantha still alive? Was this even real? Or had we walked into something we didn't understand? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. The drive was eerily quiet. Neither of us spoke much, both too lost in our thoughts. The address was pulling us somewhere, but we had no idea what we were walking into. The air in the car was thick with tension. I kept glancing at Jordan, watching as his hands clenched and unclenched around the steering wheel. He was always the calm one, the rational one, but even he looked rattled. I stared out the window, my fingers drumming anxiously against my knee. The city lights faded behind us, replaced by empty highways and stretches of dark forest. The deeper we drove, the more my stomach twisted. We weren't headed toward a neighborhood or even a town. We were heading into nothingness. Finally, the GPS announced, "You have arrived." Jordan pulled the car to a stop on the side of a dirt road. No houses, no signs, just a long, winding path leading into the trees. My breath hitched. "What the hell is this?" Jordan muttered. I checked my phone. No signal. The road behind us was completely empty. Jordan turned to me. "Are we really doing this?" I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave. But then I thought of Samantha. If there was even a chance she was here, I couldn't just walk away. I swallowed hard. "Yeah, we are." Jordan sighed, but nodded. "All right." We got out of the car. The trees stretched tall around us, swallowing the sky, blocking out what little moonlight there was. A faint path led deeper into the woods, barely visible. My heart hammered in my chest. We followed it. The deeper we went, the colder it got. The air felt wrong, like something was pressing down on us. Neither of us spoke. Then, after what felt like forever, I saw it. The house. Not abandoned, not broken down. Just wrong. It was too ordinary, standing there in the middle of nowhere like it had no business being here. A simple, single-story home with a porch light glowing weakly in the dark. Jordan tensed beside me. Preda Ivor Mundela Taba. El, he whispered. I didn't have an answer. Then I saw the car, parked just off to the side of the house. A silver sedan, Samantha's car. My pulse spiked. He's here, I whispered. Jordan exhaled sharply. He scanned the trees like he was expecting someone to jump out at us. No movement, no sound, just the house. Waiting. Jordan reached into his jacket, pulling out a pocket knife. I raised an eyebrow. Since when do you carry that? He shot me a look. Since my boyfriend started getting followed by a cult. Fair enough. I took a slow breath, then stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked beneath my weight. My stomach churned. I tried the doorknob. It wasn't locked. I turned it slowly, glancing at Jordan. He nodded, gripping the knife tighter. We stepped inside. The air inside was stale. Not abandoned, but unused. The kind of stillness that clings to places where people don't live, but... Wait. A dim hallway stretched in front of us, leading to a living room. The furniture was plain. A couch, a coffee table, a television. The walls were lined with framed photographs. I glanced at one. My stomach turned. They were all the same person. A man mid-40s in different locations, different clothes. In one, he was standing on a beach. In another, he was sitting at a diner, smiling slightly at the camera. Jordan stepped closer, eyes scanning the faces. Who the hell is this? I didn't know. But then I noticed the paperwork on the table. An open notebook. I stepped forward, heart hammering, and picked it up. The handwriting was precise, neat. Step 1, create belief. Step 2, remove the noise. Step 3, take what was always meant to be yours. I flipped the page. That's when I saw her name. Samantha. My breath caught. There were notes beneath it. Details, dates, locations, the history of her posts, a timeline of everything she had done leading up to now. Jordan stiffened beside me. And then we heard it. A noise. Soft footsteps. From down the hall. I grabbed Jordan's wrist, eyes wide. Someone else was here. The footsteps grew louder. A shadow moved at the end of the hallway. Jordan grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the door. We turned to run, but before we could, a voice rang out. Calm, measured, too steady. You're not supposed to be here. I felt my blood run cold. The figure stepped forward into the dim light. A man, late 40s, wearing a button-down shirt neatly tucked into his pants. Then I recognized him. I had never seen him before, but I had seen his face in the pictures on the wall. Jordan tensed beside me. He was gripping his pocket knife so tightly his knuckles were white. The man took another step toward us, his expression unreadable. They shouldn't have come here, he said again. I swallowed hard. My mouth was dry. Where's Samantha? I forced out. A slow smile curled at the corner of his lips. Gone. A sharp spike of terror went through me. I took a step back. Jordan moved with me, his shoulders tight. The man didn't stop us. He just tilted his head slightly, watching, studying. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "They left something for you." I froze. Jordan's grip on my wrist tightened. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Then, slowly, he extended it toward me. Every part of me was screaming not to take it, but my hand was moving before I could stop it. I unfolded the paper. A single sentence was written inside. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. My breath caught. It was her handwriting. A chill crept through my body. I looked up at the man, heart pounding. His expression didn't change. Jordan took a sharp breath, pulling me back toward the door. "We're leaving," he said. The man didn't stop us. He just smiled. And then, as we stepped out onto the porch, he said something that still haunts me. "She'll come back when she's ready." We didn't wait. We ran. And as we reached the car, I felt it. The weight of unseen eyes watching from the trees. Waiting. Always waiting. We drove in silence for the first 20 minutes. The only sound the steady hum of the tires against the road. I couldn't stop shaking. My fingers ached from gripping the folded note too tightly. The paper slightly crumpled now. Samantha's words burned in my mind. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Jordan's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. His jaw was set, his body rigid. He hadn't said a word since we fled that house, but I could feel his tension, radiating off him in waves. Finally, he exhaled sharply, knuckles tightening even further. We need to go to the police. I swallowed, my throat dry. And say what? Jordan turned to me, disbelief flashing in his eyes. Say that your best friend is missing, Elliot. Say that there's a psycho living in the woods who has a goddamn shrine of her. I clenched my fists. The cops won't care. They have to. I shook my head. They didn't before. And this isn't just some guy stalking her. This is something else. Jordan let out a bitter laugh. So what? We just forget about it. Pretend that didn't just happen. I had no answer. Because I didn't know what we had just walked into. And the worst part, neither of us saw the car following us. We didn't go home. Neither of us could stomach the idea of returning to our apartments, where we'd be alone, vulnerable, where someone could be waiting in the shadows. Instead, we drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where the walls were thin, the bedspreads were stiff, and the guy at the front desk barely looked up as he took our cash. The moment we got inside, Jordan double-locked the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, still gripping Samantha's note, my mind racing. Jordan ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. We need a plan, he muttered. We need to figure out what the hell is going on. I looked up at him. I think it's already too late. His pacing stopped. Don't say that. I met his eyes. Jordan, she's gone. And whatever happened to her, whoever took her, is watching us too. Jordan exhaled, running a hand over his face. He looked exhausted, his face pale under the dim motel light. After a moment, he dropped onto the bed beside me. Neither of us spoke. The weight of everything pressed down, suffocating, crushing. Then my phone buzzed. I jumped, my pulse spiking as I grabbed it. The screen lit up. A message from a blocked number. 3 words. Check under the car. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. Jordan saw my face and grabbed it, scanning the screen. His jaw clenched, then without a word he stood up and pulled the curtain aside. The motel parking lot stretched out beneath the flickering yellow light. Our car sat exactly where we left it. Empty still, no sign of anyone watching. But my stomach twisted. Stay here, Jordan said, voice low, firm. No way, I shot back, standing. I'm not letting you go out there alone. Jordan clenched his jaw but didn't argue. We left the room together. The air outside was thick, too still for the middle of the night. I kept my head on a swivel, eyes scanning the shadows, waiting for movement. Jordan crouched near the car. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as he reached underneath. His fingers brushed against something. He froze, and then he pulled it out. A small black tracking device. I stumbled back. Jesus Christ. Jordan turned the device over in his hands, his breathing sharp and uneven. We need to go now. We didn't pack. We didn't check out. We just ran. Jordan drove, gripping the wheel so hard I thought it might snap. I kept glancing behind us, waiting for headlights, waiting for a shadow in the rearview mirror. But the road was empty. The night stretched long before us, swallowing everything behind us. Where are we going? I asked. Jordan didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the road, his jaw tight. Jordan, finally he spoke. We're finding her. My stomach clenched. How? Jordan's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. We're going back to the beginning. I frowned. What does that mean? Jordan exhaled sharply, eyes darting to me before turning back to the road. We're going back to where it started, he said. To the first post. The first riddle my breath caught. The oracles await. I had buried that account, tried to forget it. But I knew Jordan was right. If we wanted to understand this, if we wanted to find Samantha, we had to go back into the game. We drove through the night chasing breadcrumbs of our own creation. The oracles awaited started as a joke, a harmless game. But now it had led us here. Hunted, followed, tracked. We were going back to where it all began. Jordan pulled into an empty parking lot behind an all-night diner. The only sound was the hum of the streetlights buzzing overhead. I was exhausted, wired on fear and adrenaline, but my hands moved instinctively. I pulled out my phone and searched for the original Oracle's Await page. It was still there, active. Someone had been posting. My stomach twisted as I scrolled through the latest updates. The riddles, the cryptic phrases. They weren't from Samantha anymore. Whoever had taken over the account was still playing the game. The most recent post was from 30 minutes ago. Truth is a circle. It always returns to the beginning. Attached was a photo. My breath caught. It was Samantha's car, parked in an empty lot. This lot. I scrambled out of the car so fast my legs nearly gave out. Jordan followed, cursing under his breath as he pulled me back. Elliot, wait. I didn't listen. I ran. Across the lot, past the dumpsters, toward the car I hadn't seen in weeks but knew better than my own. The driver's door was slightly ajar. The inside was dark. Jordan caught up to me just as I reached out and yanked the door open. The car was empty, but there was a note in the driver's seat, a single line. You were supposed to listen. My blood turned ice cold. A shuffling sound behind us. Jordan spun around. My chest tightened. There was no one there. The air was too still, the silence too full. We were being watched. Jordan's fingers tightened around my wrist. We need to go, now. For once, I didn't argue. We backed away from the car, moving fast, scanning the shadows. My pulse pounded, my breath shallow. And then my phone buzzed, a message from a blocked number. Stop looking, you don't want to find her. I froze. Jordan grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the car. Elliot, we're leaving. I could barely think. My mind raced through every possibility, every outcome. Samantha was gone. Whoever had taken her was still watching us, still playing the game, and we weren't in control, not anymore. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to move. Jordan threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as we sped out of the lot. Neither of us spoke, because we both knew the truth. Samantha wasn't coming back, not unless they wanted her to, and if we kept digging, we might be next. We stopped searching after that night. The posts kept coming, more riddles, more photos of places we recognized, but we never followed them. Eventually, the updates slowed. Then, one day, the account disappeared, just like Samantha. I don't know if she's alive. I don't know if she chose this or if she was taken. All I know is that I still check my locks twice before bed, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, my phone buzzes. A message from an unknown number. I never open them because I already know what they say. The oracles await. I think my girlfriend killed someone in her sleep, and I have proof. I don't know how to start this. I guess I could say it began the night I first heard her sleep talking, but that's not really true. It started long before that. I just didn't realize it at the time. Her name is Emily. And she's perfect, or at least she was, the kind of woman you don't expect to walk into your life. Beautiful in a way that feels effortless, like she never had to try. She has this sharp, cutting wit that makes you feel like you have to keep up, like she's always 2 steps ahead. I met her at a coffee shop. It's cliché, I know, but it was one of those perfect movie moments. I was waiting for my order. She was balancing a book in one hand and a latte in the other. She nearly dropped both when I bumped into her. I apologized, offered to buy her another, and somehow, by the time we left, I had her number. It didn't take long before we were inseparable. She moved in after 6 months. It felt fast, but everything about Emily was intoxicating. You couldn't say no to her, not really. She had this way of making it seem like every decision was yours, even though, in hindsight, I think it was always hers. For a while, life was good. And then, the sleep-talking started. The first time it happened, I barely noticed. It was a little past 3 a.m. I was half awake, rolling over in bed when I heard it. A low murmur, barely more than a whisper. I thought she was talking to me at first. I mumbled something back, probably just, huh? But she didn't respond. Her breathing stayed slow, steady, asleep. I told myself it was nothing. But then it kept happening, not every night, but often enough that I started noticing. Sometimes it was soft and indistinct, just meaningless sounds. Other times, she would form actual words. I remember one night, about a month in, when I actually listened. I was lying there half asleep when her voice cut through the silence. Don't struggle. I felt my body tense. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the tone, calm, steady, like she wasn't dreaming at all. I turned my head toward her, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Her face was completely relaxed, lips slightly parted, her breath slow and even. She was asleep. I swallowed hard and rolled onto my back, staring at the ceiling. It's just nonsense, I told myself. Dreams don't mean anything. I ignored the nagging feeling in my gut and eventually drifted back to sleep. I shouldn't have ignored it, because that was the first real warning. The talking continued for weeks, but it was always scattered. Random phrases, things I couldn't piece together. Then, one night I woke up to her laughing. It was soft, barely a chuckle, but there was something wrong about it. I turned over, my heart already racing. Her eyes were shut, her body still, but then she whispered something that made my skin crawl. I buried him deep. I stopped breathing. I must have stiffened or moved, because suddenly she rolled toward me, still completely asleep. You won't find him. A chill ran down my spine. I sat up, swallowing hard, forcing myself to breathe. It was just sleep talking, I told myself. Just nonsense. But something felt different this time. This didn't sound like a dream, it sounded like a memory. I couldn't let it go after that. I started paying attention. I bought a sleep recorder app, one of those that only activates when it detects sound. I wanted to prove to myself that it was nothing. Instead, I made it worse, because what I recorded, I wish I had never heard it. The next morning I sat in bed, staring at my phone. My chest was tight, fingers hovering over the screen. I had spent the night recording Emily's sleep, and I wasn't sure I actually wanted to listen. The app had flagged multiple clips, small timestamps, little moments where she spoke in the dark. I swallowed hard and pressed play. At first, it was the usual, soft murmurs, indistinct words. But then, at around 2:47 a.m., her voice cut through the static. It was easy. I felt my body go rigid. The next clip autoplayed. He stopped breathing fast. My fingers clenched the phone. Another recording. A long silence, then. They always do. I dropped the phone. It clattered onto the nightstand, screen still glowing. Emily stirred beside me, shifting under the covers. For the first time since I had met her, I felt afraid of her. This wasn't just sleep talking. She wasn't mumbling about work stress or bad dreams. She was talking about a person who stopped breathing, a person she had buried. I sat there, heartbeat hammering in my skull, my entire body stiff with an anxiety I couldn't shake. I needed to know if it was just crazy dreams, or if I was sleeping next to something much worse. That's when I made my second mistake. I decided to look into her past. Emily never talked much about her life before we met. Whenever I asked about her childhood, she'd deflect, shift the conversation, steer it somewhere else. At the time, I thought it was just how she was. Now it felt like a red flag I'd been too blind to see. While she was at work, I sat at my desk, laptop open, trying to piece together who she really was. Social media, barely anything, a few old photos, accounts that hadn't been updated in years. School records, sparse. She had moved around a lot, transferred from different colleges. Nothing set off alarms, until I searched for her name alongside missing person reports. That's when I found something. A news article. A man had disappeared a few years ago in a town just outside of where Emily used to live. A man who had briefly dated someone named Emily. His name was Mark Davidson, vanished without a trace. No signs of struggle, no evidence, just gone. And the last person to see him, Emily. A weight pressed against my chest. I stared at the screen, the words blurring together, my breath coming too fast. It was probably a coincidence. It had to be. Except, the night before, Emily had whispered something in her sleep. You won't find him. I shut the laptop. For the first time I thought about leaving, packing my things, making up an excuse, getting out before she came home. But I didn't, because I needed proof. And that was my third mistake. That night, I set up another recording. Emily curled up beside me, completely unaware, breathing slow and steady. I forced myself to close my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I waited. Hours passed. The room was silent, except for the occasional creak of the apartment settling. Then, somewhere past 3 a.m., Emily shifted. Her breathing changed. And then, in the quiet, she spoke. You know, don't you? I felt my entire body lock up. She was asleep. I didn't move, didn't breathe. She rolled onto her back, eyes still shut, lips curling into something that almost looked like a smile. It's okay. A pause. Then, I was going to tell you soon. I felt sick. I lay there, stiff as stone, listening to her breathing even out again. She was still asleep. But I knew, right then and there, that I had to get out. I had to leave before she woke up. Because if she knew that I knew, I wouldn't get another chance. My entire body went numb. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against my skin like a weight. The only sound was the hum of the old heater and the thudding of my own pulse. Emily didn't move. She just stood there, watching me. I couldn't tell if she was waiting for me to speak, or if she was waiting for me to run. She knew. She knew I had recorded her. And now, I had no idea what she was going to do. I forced myself to swallow. My throat felt tight, dry. Emily, I said, voice barely above a whisper, I just need some space, that's all. She smiled, but it wasn't real. It was careful, measured. I get that, she murmured. But why would you record me, Jason? I didn't answer, because what the hell could I say? She took another step forward. I stepped back, bumping into the doorframe. The way she was looking at me now, it wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was understanding, like she had finally figured me out, and that terrified me. Emily sighed softly, glancing at the phone still glowing on the nightstand. Then, before I could react, she moved. Fast. I lunged for the phone, but she was quicker. Her fingers wrapped around it before I could reach it, and suddenly she was turning it over in her hands, scrolling through the recordings. I saw the moment she found it. Her lips parted just slightly, her brows lifted in amusement. Then she looked back at me. He stopped breathing fast. She read aloud. Calm. My stomach churned. She played another clip. They always do. The room felt colder. Emily exhaled through her nose, her expression neutral, but her grip on the phone tightened. And then she laughed. Not loud, not fake. Just a quiet, genuine laugh. She lifted her gaze to mine. You think I killed someone? I couldn't speak. She tilted her head slightly. That's why you've been so weird lately, isn't it? I opened my mouth, but no words came. Emily took a slow step forward, and then she did something that made my blood turn to ice. She deleted the recording. Right in front of me. A single swipe of her thumb. Gone. I lunged, but she pulled the phone back, raising an eyebrow. Jason, she said softly, like she was scolding a child. You're not being very smart about this. I clenched my fists. You had no right. No, she interrupted. I have every right. You recorded me while I was asleep. You invaded my privacy. She tilted her head. If anyone should be upset, it's me. My jaw clenched. That's not... She took another step forward. I took another step back. Her voice softened. What exactly do you think I've done, Jason? I swallowed. I saw the news article. She blinked. For a split second, something flashed behind her eyes. Then she smiled. Ah, Mark Davidson. The air shifted. She wasn't denying it. She wasn't laughing it off. I felt a sharp chill crawl down my spine. Emily took a slow breath, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. Okay, she said simply. I frowned. What? She pocketed my phone. If you're so sure, let's go to the police. I felt my chest tighten. She shrugged. You said you saw something, right? You think I killed him, so let's go. The room was spinning. Emily wasn't panicked. She wasn't scared. She was calling my bluff. And suddenly I realized, she knows there's no proof she had planned for this. Every part of me screamed to run, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I forced a breath. Fine. Emily's smile widened. Great. She grabbed her keys, and we left together. The car ride was silent. Emily drove like nothing was wrong, one hand resting lazily on the wheel, the other tapping against her knee. I sat stiff beside her, my mind racing. I had to be careful. One wrong move, one wrong word, and I wouldn't make it to the station. I watched the road signs. We were headed the right way. But then, after 20 minutes of driving, Emily took a turn away from town. My chest tightened. Where are we going? I asked. She hummed. Shortcut. That was a lie. The trees thickened around us. The roads got narrower. And suddenly, I knew. She wasn't taking me to the police. She was taking me somewhere else. Somewhere no one would hear me. I had to get out, but before I could move, Emily slammed the brakes. My body lurched forward. The seatbelt locked tight across my chest. Before I could react, she turned toward me. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were dark. Jason, she murmured. I swallowed hard. What? She tilted her head. You should have stopped listening. A cold spike of fear shot through me. Then, she smiled and locked the doors. The click of the lock sounded too final. My pulse jumped, a hot wave of panic spreading through my chest. I reached for the handle on instinct, but Emily's fingers wrapped around my wrist before I could touch it. Her grip wasn't tight. She wasn't hurting me, but I couldn't move. Jason, she murmured, tilting her head. Where are you going? Her voice was gentle, like we were discussing something as simple as what to have for dinner. I forced myself to keep my breathing even. You said we were going to the police. Emily's expression remained unreadable. Then she laughed softly, shaking her head. You don't actually want that, do you? Her fingers loosened, but she didn't let go. You're scared. She studied me, her dark eyes searching mine, but not of me. I didn't speak. Her fingers slipped away, and she leaned back into her seat, exhaling as she drummed her nails lightly against the steering wheel. You're scared of being wrong. I swallowed, the car suddenly feeling too small, the air too still. You think you know something, she continued, voice smooth, but you don't. You have little pieces, sure, but that's all they are, pieces. She let the silence stretch. Then she turned her head toward me. So tell me, she said, her voice no longer soft, what exactly do you think I did? I hesitated. My stomach felt uneasy, a queasy rolling that wouldn't settle. Emily didn't blink. She was waiting. I had two options. I could lie, tell her I overreacted, that I didn't actually believe anything, that I just got spooked. Or I could say it, say what I really thought. I wet my lips, my throat dry as sandpaper. Mark Davidson. For the first time since I'd known her, Emily stilled completely. It was subtle, but she didn't move, didn't shift, didn't breathe. And in that moment, I knew. Her fingers flexed slightly against the wheel. Then, she sighed. I was really hoping you wouldn't say that. I exhaled, trying to steady my racing thoughts. So it's true. Emily's expression didn't change. She let out a slow breath, then unlocked the doors. I hesitated. You can go, she murmured. If you really think that, Jason, if you actually, genuinely believe I killed him, get out of the car. Walk away. A trap. That's what it felt like she was testing me. The car sat in the middle of nowhere, trees towering around us, the only light coming from the headlights, casting long shadows across the road. I could step outside. I could start running. But she would still be behind me, watching. I didn't move. Emily sighed again, shaking her head unsee. She smiled. You don't really believe it. She was reeling me in, twisting things. I could feel it. I forced myself to exhale. My body coiled so tightly, I felt like I might snap. I need you to tell me the truth, I said quietly. Emily rolled her eyes. Jason, you've already made up your mind. I swallowed hard. She studied me again, and then she reached into her jacket pocket. My heartbeat spiked, but all she pulled out was a small folded photograph. She handed it to me. I hesitated. Then cautiously, I took it. I unfolded it, fingers trembling slightly, and my stomach twisted into a knot. It was a picture of me, sleeping. The blood drained from my face. I looked up, my throat tight. Emily was smiling. I told you, she murmured. You were never in danger. She tilted her head. Not until you started asking questions. My vision tunneled, the picture in my hands blurred. Jason, she said softly. I couldn't breathe. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. But you've always been such a good listener. Her fingers brushed mine. Tell me. She smiled. Are you listening now? The weight of the photo in my hands was unbearable. A picture of me asleep taken from inside my own home. I could barely keep my hands from shaking. My mouth felt dry, my pulse a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. Emily was still watching me. Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, waiting, daring me to react. I had to be smart, careful. If I panicked now, I wouldn't get out of this. I forced myself to swallow, forcing the fear deep down, where she couldn't see it. Emily, I said, my voice strained. What is this? She laughed softly, like I had asked her something stupidly obvious. It's a photo, Jason. She tilted her head slightly, tapping her nails against the steering wheel. A reminder. I forced my fingers to unclench. My mind was racing, calculating my next move. If I lunged for the door, would I make it? If I ran, how far would I get? Emily sighed, stretching her arms before turning toward me again. You keep acting like this is some big mystery, Jason, like there's something to solve. She gestured toward the photo still clutched in my hand. But really, you already know the answer. I took a slow breath, forcing my expression to stay neutral. But don't let her see you unravel. Okay, I said carefully, and then tell me. She considered me for a moment. Then, I don't like when people leave. A cold prickle crawled up my arms. Emily smiled. You wouldn't leave, would you? I could feel the walls closing in. Every exit was already blocked. I had no proof, no recordings, no way to stop her. And I had the sinking feeling that she knew it. I needed to get out. I needed to leave, now. But Emily could read me too well. She must have seen the decision settle in my bones. Because the second my fingers twitched toward the door handle, she moved. Her hand shot forward, wrapping around my wrist, tight this time. Not hurting, but firm. Enough to tell me that I wasn't going anywhere. Jason, she murmured, her fingers pressing against my pulse. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but I knew she could feel it, the erratic pounding beneath my skin. Emily sighed, tilting her head. I really hoped it wouldn't come to this. My chest tightened. She let out a breath, like she was debating something. Then she released me. I felt my shoulders tense, preparing to bolt. But then, She reached into her jacket again and my body went completely still. I braced myself for a knife, a gun, anything. But all she pulled out was a single, folded piece of paper. She handed it to me. "Last chance," she said. I hesitated, then slowly unfolded it. My stomach turned. It was a list of names. Some I didn't recognize, but at the very bottom, Jason Carter, my own name. My head snapped up. Emily was watching me, calmly, patiently, like she was waiting to see what I'd do next. "This isn't a threat," she murmured. My fingers tightened around the paper. She leaned in slightly. "It's a promise." The air felt too thin. My thoughts were scrambling for a way out, and then Emily sighed. "Say it, Jason," she murmured. My breath hitched. "Say what?" Her fingers brushed my wrist again, feather light. "Say you were wrong." My mind screamed at me to lie, to say anything she wanted to hear, but my body was frozen. Emily gave me a small knowing smile, and then she reached toward the lock. Click. She unlocked the doors. She let me go. I didn't question it. I didn't hesitate. I threw the door open and ran. I didn't stop running until I saw streetlights, until I saw cars, people, signs of life. I was shaking, breathless, my heart hammering so violently I thought I might collapse. But I didn't look back, not once, because I knew if I saw her watching me, I'd never stop running. I moved out of town the next day, changed my number, deleted social media, and for a while, nothing happened. Emily disappeared from my life as quickly as she had entered it. No calls, no messages, no signs she had ever existed at all. But I knew better. She was still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, my phone buzzes. Unknown number. No message, no voicemail, just silence, like she's reminding me. I got away. For now. But the next time I see her name, it won't be a message. It'll be a list. And I don't know if I'll get a second chance to run. I've always been fascinated by the internet, not just the surface web, the part everyone uses daily, but the deeper layers. The kind of places you don't just stumble across. The kind of places you have to look for. I grew up online, spending countless hours learning how things worked, coding, networking, even a little ethical hacking. I wasn't a professional by any means, but I knew my way around. I understood how to protect myself, how to stay anonymous. The internet was my playground, a vast, endless maze of information, and I prided myself on knowing how to navigate it. But the more time you spend on something, the more it loses its excitement. The regular web had become boring to me. Social media, streaming, forums, they all felt shallow. That's why I started exploring the dark web. Not because I had any real reason to, but because it was there. A hidden world beneath the surface, full of mystery and secrecy. At first it was nothing special. Just black market sites, conspiracy forums, weird archives of books and documents that weren't supposed to exist. Most of it was exaggerated, clickbait for the paranoid, but every once in a while I'd find something truly disturbing. Something that didn't feel like it was meant to be seen. And that's where this all started. It was around 2 a.m. when I came across a discussion thread that caught my attention. It had no title, just a string of random letters and numbers, and only a handful of replies. The first post was simple. If you know, you know. If you don't, leave. I had seen cryptic messages like this before. Usually they led to some nonsense, but I was bored, and I had nothing better to do. I clicked. The page that loaded was strange. A black background with a single blinking cursor like an old command prompt. No images, no links, just a text box. Enter your request. I hesitated. It looked like some kind of database, maybe an archive. I decided to test it. I typed, "Show me something interesting." For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered, and a file name appeared. Watch Me MP4. The download prompt followed. I hesitated. I knew better than to open random files from the dark web, but my curiosity got the best of me. I ran a quick scan. No viruses detected. A against my better judgment, I opened it. The video was low quality, grainy, like it had been recorded on an old phone. It showed a dark room dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. In the center of the frame was a wooden chair. Someone was sitting in it, their face covered by a white cloth sack, their hands tied behind their back. My stomach twisted. The camera was completely still, like it had been set up and left to record. No movement, no sound, just the eerie image of this bound figure sitting alone in the dark. I skipped forward, but nothing changed. No one entered the frame, no one spoke. Just silence. Then, near the end of the video, something happened. The bulb flickered more aggressively, casting sharp shadows across the room. The figure in the chair twitched slightly, just enough to let me know they were still alive. Then the screen glitched. For a single frame, something flashed across the screen. Something I barely caught before the video cut to black. I paused and went back frame by frame. When I found it, my breath caught in my throat. A face, pale, emotionless, standing right behind the chair. Someone had been there the whole time, watching. I closed the video and sat back in my chair, my skin crawling. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I had seen disturbing things before, but something about this felt different. Like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I closed the site and cleared my history, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. It was just a video, probably fake, some weird underground horror project. That's what I told myself. But as I sat there, staring at my screen, a notification popped up. A new message. No username, no subject, just a single sentence. Did you like what you saw? I felt my stomach drop. I didn't reply. I didn't even move. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen. How had they messaged me? I had used a VPN, routed my connection through multiple servers. My setup was solid. There was no way someone could have traced me. Another message appeared. You shouldn't have watched that. I reached for my mouse, ready to shut everything down, but before I could, a final message popped up. And this time, it wasn't a question. It was my full name. And beneath it, my home address. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. No, this had to be some kind of trick, some scare tactic. Maybe the website logged IPs after all, and they were using it to mess with me. But then I saw the next line of text appear. Mom, Dad, little sister, her full name. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just my information, they knew my family. I shot up from my chair so fast it nearly tipped over. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned around, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow in my room. My blinds were shut, my door locked. But for the first time in my life, I felt completely exposed. I turned back to my computer and slammed the power button, killing the screen instantly. My reflection stared back at me from the black monitor, my own face pale, my eyes wide with panic. I needed to think. I needed to do something. I grabbed my phone and checked the front door camera feed. Nothing. The street outside was empty, just the usual parked cars and dim street lights. But that didn't mean I was safe. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The line rang twice before a dispatcher picked up. 911, what's your emergency? I took a breath, trying to steady my voice. I think someone's stalking me, online. They sent me my address, my family's names. I don't know how they got it. Are you home alone? Yes. Have you seen anyone outside your residence? I hesitated. No. But a notification sound went off. My phone screen lit up with a new message. Unknown number. Calling the cops won't help. My breath caught in my throat. Sir, the dispatcher asked, are you still there? I swallowed hard. Yeah, I just got another message. Do not respond, she said firmly. Stay on the line with me. I'm dispatching an officer to your location now. I wanted to believe that would help, but deep down I knew whoever this was had already gotten too close. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. I stood by the window, phone gripped in my sweaty palm, eyes locked on the street outside. Still nothing, no movement. Then, finally, blue and red lights. I lit out out a shaky breath as the patrol car pulled up in front of my house. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the area before approaching my door. I opened it before they even knocked. "You reported an online threat," one of them asked, his voice calm but serious. I nodded, stepping aside to let them in. They knew everything about me, my address, my family, everything. The older officer, Ramirez, gestured to my desk. "Can you show us the messages?" I hesitated before powering my PC back on. My fingers felt stiff as I moved the mouse, navigating back to the chat. But when I opened the messages, they were gone. Every single one. The thread was empty, like it had never existed. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process it. They were here, I swear. Ramirez gave me a long, unreadable look before turning to his partner. The younger cop, Hendricks, crossed his arms. "Are you sure this wasn't just some elaborate prank?" "Huh?" A wave of frustration crashed over me. "No, I didn't imagine it. They sent me my family's names." Ramirez sighed. "Look, we're not saying you're making this up, but if there's no evidence..." Another notification sounded. My phone. I nearly dropped it as I fumbled to unlock the screen. Another message from the unknown number. "Unknown number. They won't believe you." I turned the screen toward the officers, my pulse hammering in my ears. Ramirez's face darkened. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, we have a confirmed cyber-stalking case. Requesting cyber crimes unit involvement." Hendricks glanced out the window, suddenly more alert. "Did they say anything about coming here? About watching you?" No, I admitted. Just that I shouldn't watch the video." Ramirez's head snapped toward me. "What video?" I hesitated. It was a file I downloaded from a dark website. He exhaled sharply. "Christ, you have no idea who you pissed off, do you?" The officers stayed with me for another hour, taking statements, checking my security setup, and advising me to stay offline for a while. They also recommended changing all my passwords and contacting my ISP for extra security measures. But none of it made me feel safer, because whoever they were still watching, and they had already proven they were always one step ahead. I didn't sleep that night, even after the cops left, even after I double-checked every lock in the house, even after I turned off my computer and put my phone on silent. I just sat there here, wide awake, heart pounding. Every creak of the house made me flinch. Every shadow in the corner of my room felt wrong. I tried to convince myself that the police were right, that maybe this was just some sick online prank, some hacker screwing with me for fun. But deep down I knew better. This wasn't random. Someone had been waiting for me to find that video. The next morning I called in sick to work. There was no way I was leaving the house. Not until I figured out what was happening. I spent hours combing through my system, running every security check I knew. My VPN logs, my browser history, my firewall settings. Nothing was out of place. No backdoors, no spyware, no signs that anyone had broken into my network. But if that was true, then how did they find me? I was still staring at the screen when a new email came in. No subject, no sender. Just an attachment. "Watch me MP4. My stomach twisted. I didn't open it, not this time. Instead, I right-clicked and checked the file properties. The metadata showed that it had been created just 10 minutes ago. They were still watching me. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police again. Then my screen went black. No warning, just gone. The hum of my PC cut off. The power in my entire room shut down. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The lamp on my nightstand was still on, the hallway light still glowing under the door. The house still had power. It was just my room. Then, from the darkness of my monitor, a notification sound. My phone screen lit up. A new message. "Unknown number. No more computers. Let's talk." I almost threw my phone across the room. Instead, I forced my shaking fingers to type out a reply. "Who are you? What do you want?" 3 dots appeared. They were typing. Then the response. "Come outside." A sharp, ice-cold dread gripped my spine. I stood up, moving slowly toward the window. My hands felt numb as I pulled back the curtain just an inch. And I froze. A car sat parked across the street. Black, tinted windows. The kind you see in movies when people are being watched. I squinted, trying to make out if anyone was inside. Then, as if they knew I was looking, the headlights flashed. A small, quick burst of light. I stumbled back from the window, heart slamming against my ribs. My breathing was too fast, too shallow. I wasn't imagining this. This wasn't some digital prank. They were here, watching me, waiting. I didn't reply to the message. I didn't go outside. I just backed away from the window, forcing myself to think. The police were useless. Even if I called them again, by the time they showed up, the car would be gone. I had to do something else. I had to disappear. First, I shut off my phone, pulled out the SIM card, tossed it. Then, I grabbed my laptop and drove 3 towns over to a public library, logged into a fresh account using a brand new VPN, and sent an encrypted email to a hacker forum I knew. Need to scrub my entire digital footprint. Willing to pay. I attached a Bitcoin wallet with enough to make it worth someone's time. 5 minutes later, I got a reply. Done. Don't contact us again. Just like that, everything connected to my real identity was wiped. It wouldn't stop them from finding me physically, but at least online, I was gone. I ditched my car in a crowded parking lot and took a bus back home, making sure no one followed. Then, as soon as I got inside, I packed. Not just a bag, everything. Laptop gone. Hard drives burned. Credit cards cut up. By nightfall, my entire life was packed into a single duffel bag. I took one last look around my apartment. The place I had spent years in. The place that was supposed to be safe. Then, without looking back, I walked out the door. I wasn't coming back. I drove through the night, not stopping until I was at least 4 hours away from home. I paid in cash at a cheap motel off the highway, kept my head down, and barely slept. Every sound outside the thin motel walls sent a jolt of panic through me. I kept imagining someone forcing their way in, dragging me out into the dark. But nobody came. By morning I had a plan. I wasn't just running, I was disappearing completely. I took out as much cash as I could from an ATM before canceling my bank accounts. I bought a prepaid phone with cash, using it only to call my family and tell them I was leaving for a while. I didn't say why, just that they shouldn't worry. I didn't want them caught up in this. For weeks I moved from place to place, never staying in one town too long. I worked odd jobs under the table, paid everything in cash, avoided cameras when I could. I didn't use my real name. I didn't use the internet. Eventually the paranoia dulled. The feeling of being watched started to fade. But I never let my guard down completely, because the truth is, I still don't know who they were. A hacker group, a secret organization, just some lunatics who stumbled across me at the wrong time. I'll probably never know. What I do know is this. The dark web isn't just some playground for scary stories. It's real. And if you go looking for something you shouldn't, sometimes it finds you first. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe as a warning, maybe just to get it out of my head, or maybe because I don't know what else to do. But if you take anything from this, let it be this. Be careful what you share online, because you never know who's reading. I was 30 years old when I posted about him. By that time, I had finally started to feel safe again. The years had passed, and the memories, though still sharp, had started to lose their grip on me. I had moved on. I had healed. Or at least, that's what I told myself. When I sat down to write the post, it wasn't out of fear. It wasn't out of desperation. It was just a story. A terrible thing that had happened to me once. Something that belonged to my past. I didn't expect it to become my present again. Let me go back. Before any of this, I was just a normal woman. I had a stable job, a close-knit group of friends, and a small but comfortable apartment in a quiet neighborhood. I wasn't reckless or naive. I didn't invite danger into my life. But that didn't stop him from finding me. It started subtly. I'd notice a man at the coffee shop near my office. Always seated a few tables away, always alone. I didn't think much of it at first, until I started seeing him everywhere. The grocery store, the gym, the park where I went running on Saturday mornings. He never approached me, never spoke. He was just there. At first I rationalized it. It was a big city. People overlapped. Coincidences happened. But then the letters started. I remember the first one clearly. It was waiting for me when I got home from work, sitting neatly on my doormat. No postage, no return address. Just my name, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Inside there was a single sentence. You're even prettier up close. I felt a wave of cold dread roll through me. Still, I tried to be rational. Maybe it was a mistake, a prank, a mix-up. I threw it away and tried to forget about it. But the letters kept coming. They weren't threatening, not at first. They were admiring, intimate, the way someone might write to a lover. Except I had never met this person. You have the most beautiful laugh. I love the way you twirl your hair when you're nervous. I wish you could see yourself the way I see you. I stopped going to the coffee shop. I changed my jogging route. But it didn't matter. He was always one step ahead of me. The realization sank in one night when I was brushing my hair in the bathroom mirror. A new letter had arrived that day. It was on my bed when I got home. I shouldn't have read it, but I did. I like your hair down better. My hands went still. My scalp prickled. I looked at my reflection. My hair was up in a messy bun. He had been watching me that day. From where? My apartment, my office, somewhere else. I pressed my back against the bathroom wall, heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I had never felt so exposed. That night I called the police. They listened to my story, took notes, nodded sympathetically. Then they asked if I had any proof. I showed them the letters. They skimmed them, then shrugged. There's no actual threats in these, the officer said. Sounds like you have an admirer. Maybe someone with poor social skills, but not necessarily dangerous. I felt my stomach drop. Though there's nothing you can do. He shook his head. Change your routine. Be aware of your surroundings. Let us know if he does anything concerning. As if all of this wasn't concerning, I left the station feeling worse than when I walked in. Because now I knew the truth. I was on my own. I tried to go about my life as usual, but fear crept into everything. I started double-checking my locks, peering out my windows before leaving my apartment, glancing over my shoulder on my walk home. But the worst part was not knowing when or if he was nearby, not knowing what he wanted, not knowing when it would escalate. Then one night it did. It was raining that evening. I remember that detail clearly because the sound of water hitting my windows was the only thing keeping me calm. I had finally started to doze off when I heard it. A noise, not outside, inside, a slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard. My body froze. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was in my apartment. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling. Another creak, closer this time. I dialed 911 and whispered into the receiver. There's someone in my apartment. The dispatcher's voice was calm, steady. They told me to stay on the line, to be quiet, to wait. I did. But whoever was in my home, they didn't wait. The sound of footsteps filled the silence, moving quickly now. My bedroom door handle rattled. I scrambled out of bed, pushing my dresser against the door just as the wood splintered. A heavy weight slammed against it once, then twice. Then silence. Long, suffocating silence. I pressed my ear to the door, barely breathing. The sound of sirens cut through the night. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. The back door was unlocked. A window was left open. But nothing was taken. Nothing except my sense of safety. I moved after that, left the city, started over somewhere new. And for years, I thought I was free. I never heard from him again. No letters, no sightings. It was over. Or so I thought. Until a few months ago. I was scrolling through my phone late at night when I saw a comment on the post I had written about my stalker years ago. A new comment. From a new account. I missed you. I stared at the screen, my breath caught in my throat. Then another comment appeared. Did you really think I wouldn't find you again? I felt sick. I locked my doors, checked my windows, told myself it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I know that he's out there. And now he knows that I know. I haven't left my house in days. I keep hearing strange sounds at night, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Again. I never thought I'd be the type of person to get paranoid. I've spent my whole life working with locks, securing homes, fixing broken doors. I know what keeps people safe. But after what happened a few years ago, I don't feel safe anymore. And if you knew what I knew, you wouldn't either. I used to be a locksmith. A good one, too. I worked for a small company that handled everything from apartment lockouts to high-security installations. Most of the time it was straightforward. People lose their keys. People need their locks changed after a breakup. Nothing strange. Until I got a call one night that changed everything. It was around 9 p.m. when dispatch called me. I was just about to settle in for the night when my work phone buzzed. "Had a job for you. Last-minute call-in," my boss said. "Lady's locked out of her house. She sounds shaken up. Might be an emergency." I sighed, already exhausted from the day, but overtime meant extra pay. "Dress?" I asked. He gave it to me. It was in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes away. I grabbed my gear and headed out. The street was dark when I arrived. No street lights, just the glow from a few scattered porch lights. The house in question was a 2-story, older model, the kind with a wraparound porch and a heavy oak door. It was well maintained, nothing out of the ordinary, except for the woman standing outside. She looked to be in her late 40s, dressed in a loose cardigan and jeans. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her eyes darted around as if she expected something or someone to jump out of the shadows. She looked scared. I parked and grabbed my tools. As I walked up, I gave her the usual greeting. "Luck out, ma'am." She nodded quickly. Yes, please, She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the darkened windows. I followed her gaze. Nothing looked off. The house was still, quiet, but something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I forced a smile. "No worries. Should only take a few minutes." She nodded again, stepping aside. I knelt in front of the lock and got to work. It was an older model, but nothing I couldn't handle. As I picked, I tried to make conversation to ease her nerves. "Lose your keys?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, in a tight voice, she said, "No, I didn't lose them. Someone else has them." I stopped mid-pick, looking up. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. She was shaking. My gut twisted. "Someone broke in?" I asked carefully. She exhaled sharply, nodding. I think so. I don't know. The locks were fine when I left this morning, but when I got home, the front door was unlocked, and I never leave it unlocked." I frowned. "Did you call the police?" She hesitated again. "No. I thought about it, but..." She stopped, shaking her head. I didn't press. Some people don't trust the cops. Others don't want to cause a scene. But something about her demeanor felt off. I went back to work. Within a minute, the lock clicked. I stood up, stepping aside. "Al said," I said, "do you want me to check inside first, make sure no one's there?" She hesitated. Then she whispered, "Would you..." That was my second red flag. Locksmiths don't usually go inside. Liability and all that, but I'm not heartless. The woman looked genuinely terrified. I nodded. She reached for the handle, but stopped. Then, after a second, she gestured for me to open it instead. That was my third red flag. Something about this wasn't right. I pushed the door open. The house was dark, the air inside stale, heavy. It smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, but underneath it was something else, something off. I stepped inside, flipping the light switch. Nothing happened. "The power's out," I asked, turning back to her. She nodded. "It was fine this morning. When I got home, nothing worked." Another layer of unease settled in my gut. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a neat, perfectly normal-looking home. A couch, a coffee table, family photos on the wall. But something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there. That quiet, creeping sensation that something isn't where it should be. I stepped further inside, scanning the living room. Everything looked untouched. Then I saw the hallway. The door at the end was open, just slightly, like someone had been watching the front door and left in a hurry. A chill ran through me. I turned to the woman, keeping my voice steady. "You said the door was unlocked when you got home." She nodded. I swallowed. "Did you check inside before you called me?" She shook her head. My pulse spiked. That meant whoever had been here could still be inside. Slowly, I reached into my bag, pulling out the heavy-duty flashlight I kept for jobs like this. I stepped toward the hallway, moving as quietly as possible. The air grew thicker. The smell, stale, human, got stronger. I reached the open door, pushed it, and froze. The closet was full of blankets, old boxes, and hanging coats. But between them, half hidden in the dark, I saw a pair of shoes, and they weren't empty. My chest locked up. Someone was in there. I didn't move. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that I was seeing things, that the shoes were just part of them. Then they shifted. I backed up fast, heart slamming against my ribs. "There's someone in your house." My voice was low, urgent. "We need to go. Now." The woman's eyes widened. She turned, bolting for the door. I didn't look back. We ran onto the porch just as something inside moved. A rustling sound, then the soft, unmistakable creak of floorboards. We sprinted to my van. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking. The woman was already sobbing. I dialed 911. When the cops arrived, they searched the house. Nothing. No one inside. No signs of forced entry. No proof that anyone had been there at all. But here's the part that still haunts me. They found a crawl space in the attic. Inside it, a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, a small pile of clothing. Someone had been living there, watching, listening, waiting. That was the last job I ever took. Because now, every time I hear a creak in my own house, I wonder if someone is still inside. I used to see him nearly every morning, always standing near the corner of Foster and 8th, where the city met the quieter, more residential streets. He never begged, never moved, just stood there in the same worn-out gray coat, hands tucked into his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing against a cold only he could feel. At first I didn't pay him much mind. It's a city, people exist in their own worlds. But after a few weeks, I started to notice him. His face was lean, hollow, like someone who had either given up or been worn down by something much larger than himself. His dark eyes didn't dart around like most people in his situation. They stayed locked on one point. The entrance to my office building. Them. I tried not to dwell on it. I'd remind myself that cities were full of forgotten people, those who had simply slipped through the cracks of life. It wasn't my place to judge or interfere. But that didn't explain the feeling. The one that started creeping in after a month or so. The sense that he wasn't just standing there, that he was waiting. I was never the kind of person to fixate on things. I had my routine, my job, my small, predictable life, and I liked it that way. I wasn't the guy who noticed strangers, or who let his mind wander into places it didn't belong. Maybe that's why it took me so long to put the pieces together. Or maybe I just didn't want to. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where nothing ever really changed. My father was a quiet man, an observer. He wasn't warm, not in the way my mother was. He didn't fill the house with laughter or soft reassurances. But he was constant, reliable in his own way. He worked hard, but never spoke much about his job. As a kid, I thought nothing of it. Parents go to work, they come home. That was life. My mother was the opposite of him, vibrant, full of life, someone who left a room feeling lighter than when she'd entered it. She balanced him out. For the most part, we were normal. We weren't were solid. Until we weren't. Until the day he left. I was 17, old enough to understand that something was wrong, but not old enough to know how to fix it. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no long, painful speeches about broken love or resentment. One day he just left, walked out the door, and never came back. The police took the report. They asked the questions. My mother cried, then grew quiet, then stopped speaking about him entirely. It was as if, overnight, he had simply been erased from our lives. And maybe that was easier. Maybe it was better than the not knowing. At least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I always knew it was a lie. Because you don't just disappear. Not without reason. Not without leaving something behind. Hadn't thought about him in years. Not until that morning, when I finally looked closer at the man on the corner. The moment I saw the jacket, I felt my stomach tighten. At first I didn't understand why. It was just an old coat, nothing remarkable. Faded, tattered at the cuffs, the color worn from time. And then it clicked. I'd seen that jacket before. Not just somewhere. On someone. My father. It had a gray wool coat exactly like it. The same cut, the same worn fabric, the same small tear near the left sleeve. The same missing top button. My head felt light. I blinked, gripping the strap of my bag as if it could tether me to the ground. It was impossible. It had been 10 years. And yet there it was, the jacket. My father's jacket, worn by a man I had never met. That day, instead of walking past him, I stopped. Up close, the details were even clearer. The jacket wasn't just similar, it was the same one. I could see the faint stain near the collar, the exact way the fabric had creased over years of wear. My throat was dry, my pulse hammered in my ears. "Where did you get that coat?" I asked. The man's expression didn't change. For a long moment, he just watched me. Then, slowly, he reached up, fingers brushing over the patch on the sleeve. His voice, when it came, was quiet. It was given to me. A chill ran through me. By who? He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering whether to answer. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he said, "By a man who lost everything." My blood ran cold. I felt the air shift around me, the city noise fading into the background. I stepped closer. Who was he? A pause. Then he spoke. Low, careful. "You already know." A memory surfaced, a conversation I hadn't thought about in years. I was 15, sitting across from my father at the kitchen table. It had been one of those rare moments where he spoke about himself, about his past. "Some people don't just disappear," he had said. His voice was quiet, like he was talking to himself more than to me. I had frowned. "What do you mean?" He had sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Sometimes they're made to disappear." It hadn't made sense to me then, but standing there, looking into the stranger's eyes, I understood. I wasn't just talking to some homeless man. I was talking to a ghost of my father's past. Someone who knew what happened to him. Someone who knew why he left. I took a step back. "Tell me the truth. Who are you?" The man exhaled, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Something that shattered everything I thought I knew. I'm the reason he ran. I felt my body go cold. The noise of the city faded. The distant honks, the low hum of passing voices, the shuffle of footsteps on the pavement. All of it drowned beneath the weight of his words. I'm the reason he ran. My throat tightened. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The rational part of me, the part that functioned in meetings, that paid bills, that dismissed paranoia, wanted to scoff, to shake my head, step back, and walk away. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. The way he said it wasn't dramatic. There was no smugness, no theatrics. Just a quiet, matter-of-fact statement. I took a slow breath, forcing my voice to stay even. "Right?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether I deserved an answer. Then, finally, and knew something he wasn't supposed to. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I wanted to press him for more. What did he know? Why did he leave? Where is he now? But I could barely keep my mind straight. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something deep, something dark, something I wasn't meant to look into. The man must have seen the shift in my expression because his gaze softened. "You shouldn't go looking for him," he said. "Some people disappear for a reason." I stared at him, my pulse thudding against my temples. And then, before I could say another word, he turned and walked away. It happened so fast, so casually, as if our entire conversation had never happened. He melted into the stream of pedestrians, his form swallowed by the morning crowd. I could have followed him. I almost did, but something in my gut, something primal, told me not to. I stood there for a long time, my breath uneven, my hands ice cold despite the warmth of the sun. Then, finally, I turned and went inside my office. I barely got through work that day. My mind wouldn't stop circling the same thoughts, the same possibilities. Was my father alive? Was he in hiding? And from who? I thought about calling my mother, but what would I even say? "Hey, remember Dad? Yeah, I think I just met a guy who knows what happened to him." She had worked so hard to move on, to push his disappearance into the past. Digging it back up after all these years felt wrong, but doing nothing felt worse. So, that night I did what any restless, paranoid person would do. I started searching. I didn't have much to go on, but I had my father's old records. Some paperwork my mother never threw away. A work history, old bank statements, a few contacts he had listed for emergencies. I started making calls. Most of them went nowhere, disconnected numbers, dead ends. But one answered. It was an old friend of his, a guy named Carl Whitmore. I barely remembered him, just a vague recollection of a man who used to come over for dinner a few times when I was a kid. The second I said my name, there was silence. Then, in a hushed voice, Carl asked, "Why are you calling me about your father?" My stomach clenched, because I need to know what happened to him. Another pause. Then, quieter. "Has someone been watching you?" The question sent a spike of adrenaline through me. Had someone been watching me? The man on the street. Was that what he had been doing all along? I swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. "I don't know." Carl exhaled sharply. "Listen to me. Let it go. Whatever you think you want to know, it's not worth it. Your father knew that. That's why he left." "Left to go where?" "I don't know," Carl said. "And if I did, I wouldn't tell you." "Carl, forget this number." Click. The call ended. I sat in my kitchen for a long time staring at my phone. I should have been frustrated, angry, but mostly I felt uneasy. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the tone. Carl had sounded afraid, genuinely afraid, and that terrified me. Because if he was scared, if my father had been scared, then what the hell had he gotten involved in? And more importantly, was it coming for me now? I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the conversation, trying to figure out what to do next. I wanted to keep searching, but something inside me, something instinctual, was telling me to stop, to listen to Carl, to let it go. And maybe I would have. Maybe I would have shut the door on the past and moved on with my life. But the next morning, when I stepped outside for work, I felt it. That sinking feeling. Like I was being watched. I turned my head slowly, scanning the street. Pedestrians walked by, cars crawled through traffic. Nothing out of the ordinary. And then, there, across the street, the man was back. Same tattered jacket, same hollow stare. But this time, he wasn't standing still. He was walking toward me. I didn't go to work that day. I turned around, locked my apartment door, and sat with my back against it, heart pounding, breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what he wanted. But I knew one thing. He wasn't just some homeless man. And whatever my father had run from, it had finally found me. I stayed in my apartment for the rest of the day. I didn't turn on the lights. I barely moved. Every time I so much as breathed, I felt like someone was listening. I sat by the peephole for hours, watching the hallway, waiting for a shadow to move across the door. I didn't know what I was expecting. Someone knocking, a voice calling my name, the sound of a key slipping into the lock, but nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion got the best of me. I crashed on the couch, my mind replaying every single moment of the last few days. The man on the street, the jacket, the phone call, and that one sentence that refused to leave my head. And the reason he ran. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up it was dark. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, too thick, too heavy. And then, a noise, soft, subtle, coming from outside my door. I held my breath. It wasn't knocking, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, slow, measured, someone standing just outside, listening, waiting. I stayed completely still, my fingers gripping the couch. My pulse thudded against my skull. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then, a piece of paper slid under the door. I stared at it, my whole body locking up. My apartment had no windows facing the hallway. I had no way of seeing who was out there. Seconds passed, then minutes. I didn't move until I heard the faintest sound of footsteps retreating. Slow, steady, like whoever had been there wanted me to know they weren't in a rush. Finally, when the silence stretched long enough that my ears rang from the pressure, I crawled forward. The note was folded, crisp, almost too clean for something delivered like this. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside there was only one line, written in my father's handwriting. Stop looking. I don't remember the next few minutes. Maybe I sat there, maybe I whispered something under my breath, maybe I closed my eyes and pretended I was dreaming. But deep down I knew this was real. I knew my father was alive. And more than that, I knew he was watching. I should have been relieved. I should have felt some kind of closure, some kind of answer after all these years. But I didn't. Because if he was alive, that meant he had never left. He had just been hiding from them, from the man on the street. And now, because I had been stupid enough to start digging, they knew where I was too. That night I packed a bag. I called my boss, told him I was taking a leave of absence. I didn't say why. Then I turned off my phone, threw it in the trash, and left my apartment. Not just for the night. Not just for a while. For good. Because whatever my father had been running from, whatever shadow had been looming over his life for the past 10 years, it had finally caught up to me, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out why. I sat there on the floor for what felt like an eternity, the note still clenched in my fingers. The weight of it pressed into my chest, heavy, suffocating. Stop looking. Not a warning, a command. I knew then, without a doubt, that my father was alive. But he wasn't trying to find me. He wasn't coming back. He was keeping me away. And that meant only one thing. Whatever he ran from, he was still running. And now, because I had gone looking, I had put myself in the same danger. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky, my body humming with adrenaline. My apartment suddenly felt too small, too vulnerable. I grabbed my phone, staring at the screen, debating whether to call someone. The police, my mother. But what would I even say? The man gave me a note in my missing father's handwriting. Please, help. They wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, even if an officer came by, interviewed me, what could they do? This wasn't just about a missing person. This was about someone who didn't want to be found. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside my head. I needed to be rational, logical. I needed to do what my father had done. I needed to disappear. I packed a small bag, just the essentials, cash, a change of clothes, my passport. Then, I did something I never thought I would. I pulled the SIM card from my phone, snapped it in half, and dropped it in the sink. Then, I turned on the faucet and let the water carry the tiny pieces down the drain. No more tracking, no more calls. I wasn't taking any chances. I didn't leave right away, that would be too obvious. Instead, I waited until just before dawn, when the streets were empty, when the city was quiet. I kept my hood up, my head down. I walked in the opposite direction of my office, of my usual coffee shop, of anywhere someone might expect me to go. I went to the train station, bought a ticket to a city I had never been to, and when the train doors slid shut behind me, I exhaled for the first time in hours. But as I stared out the window, watching the skyline shrink into the distance, one thought refused to leave my mind. Was it over? Or had I just put myself one step closer to whatever my father had been running from? I didn't know, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to find out, and if I was smart, I never would. That was 2 years ago. I don't live in the same city anymore. I don't use my real name. I don't stay in one place for too long. I still don't know what my father was caught up in, and I don't ask. I don't search for him. And if he's out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting, making sure I listened, I hope he knows that I did, because I don't want to know the truth anymore. I just want to be left alone. And I hope, God, I hope, they let me. For most of my life, I worked boring jobs, the kind you don't think about after you clock out. I never cared about fancy careers or promotions. I just needed to pay rent and have enough left over for a few drinks on the weekend. So when I got a job working night security at a warehouse, it seemed like a perfect fit. Get paid to do almost nothing, just walk around, check the cameras, and sit in a booth for 8 hours. Sounded easy. Until I realized something was wrong with that place. And now even years later, I can't forget what happened. Because I wasn't alone in that warehouse. And whatever was in there with me, it wasn't human. I got hired after a 5-minute. The guy barely asked any questions. Just checked that I had a clean record, nodded, and handed me a badge. The pay was decent, and since it was an overnight shift, I didn't have to deal with anyone. Just me, a giant, empty warehouse, and a set of security monitors. For the first few nights, everything was fine. The warehouse was massive. Long aisles stacked high with pallets of inventory, rows of metal shelves, the occasional forklift parked near the loading dock. But at night, the place felt different. The hum of the overhead lights was too loud. The air felt too still, and my footsteps echoed in a way that made me feel like I wasn't alone, even when I knew I was. But I brushed it off. Then, about a week in, I noticed something strange. The camera feeds didn't make sense. I had 12 monitors at my desk, each one showing a different section of the warehouse. They were old, grainy, black and white, but they worked. Until they didn't. One night, around 2 a.m., I was watching the monitors when I saw something move. It was quick, just a flicker of motion in aisle 6. I leaned forward, staring at the screen. The warehouse was supposed to be empty. No workers, no shipment scheduled until morning. I waited. Nothing. Just the endless rows of shelves, the dim glow of the emergency lights. I exhaled, shaking my head, just my eyes playing tricks on me. Then the motion detector beeped. I froze. Each aisle had a sensor programmed to detect movement. If someone was inside, the system would know. I glanced at the screen. The alert was coming from aisle 6, right where I'd seen something move. My stomach tightened. I reached for the radio, about to call it in, then stopped. Who was I even going to call? The police? What was I supposed to tell them? B, I think I saw something on the cameras. No, I don't know what. No, I don't have proof. They'd laugh me off the line. So, like an idiot, I went to check it out myself. The warehouse was dead silent as I walked in. The moment I left the security office, I regretted it. My footsteps echoed down the long corridors, bouncing off the metal shelves. The air felt thicker, like the warehouse was breathing around me. I reached aisle 6 and shined my flashlight down the row. Nothing. Just stacks of boxes. The red motion sensor light blinked steadily above me. The system had definitely picked something up. I swallowed. "Anyone in here?" I called out. My voice sounded small in the vast emptiness. No response. I stepped forward, weaving between the towering pallets. Then I saw it. A box had been pulled from one of the shelves, sitting in the middle of the aisle, like someone had been going through it. I crouched down, inspecting the label. Just some shipping inventory, nothing important. But something about it felt off. I reached out, and then, from somewhere deep in the warehouse, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A sharp, rustling movement, like someone ducking behind a shelf. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the aisle. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. The hairs on my arms stood on end. My body knew what my brain was still refusing to accept. I wasn't just being watched. I was being followed. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow. I needed to get out. Now. I turned. And then the lights cut out. Every single overhead light flickered once, then died. The entire warehouse was swallowed in darkness. And then I heard the worst thing of all. Footsteps. Right behind me. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't think. I sprinted down the aisle, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The footsteps behind me kept pace, slow and steady, like whoever or whatever was following me wasn't in a hurry. I reached the security office, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My chest heaved as I stumbled back to the monitors. My hands were shaking, my skin ice cold. The cameras were glitching. Static. Brief flashes of empty aisles. The motion sensors were all going off at once. Every single one. Then, for half a second, the static cleared, and I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still at the far end of the warehouse. Not moving, not hiding, just watching the cameras. Watching me. My stomach dropped, my vision blurred. And then, the feed cut to black. I called my boss, told him there was an intruder. Told him I was done. By the time he got there with another guard, the warehouse was empty. No signs of forced entry, nothing missing. But the cameras had been wiped. All the footage from that night, gone. My boss was pissed, said I was overreacting. But I know what I saw. And I wasn't imagining it. Because when I went to turn in my badge, I overheard two of the other guards talking. One of them laughed and said, "Ha, another one quit." The other just nodded. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "They always do. I never went back. And to this day, I wonder, was it ever really empty?" A few years back, I was in a tight spot financially. Bills were piling up, and my part-time gig at the local diner wasn't cutting it. One evening, while scrolling through job listings, I stumbled upon an ad. Earn $1,000 a week for part-time cleaning. Flexible hours. It sounded like a godsend. I was skeptical, but desperate. The contact was a local number, so I decided to call. A man named Mr. Thompson answered. He explained that they needed someone to clean out apartments after tenants had abruptly left. He assured me the job was straightforward. Clean the place, dispose of any left-behind items, and ensure it was ready for the next occupant. The pay was indeed $1,000 per week for about 20 hours of work. It seemed too good to be true, but I convinced myself that maybe I'd just gotten lucky. My first assignment was an apartment in a part of town I wasn't familiar with. The building was old, but well-maintained. Mr. Thompson met me outside, handed me the keys, and told me to call him once I was done. He didn't come in with me, which I found odd, but I brushed it off. Inside, the apartment was eerily pristine. It looked like someone had just stepped out for a moment. Dishes were in the sink, a half-empty coffee cup on the table, and even a newspaper dated 2 days prior lay on the couch. It was as if the tenant had vanished into thin air. As I started cleaning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Several times I thought I heard faint whispers, but whenever I paused to listen, there was only silence. In the bedroom, I found a journal on the nightstand. Curiosity got the better of me, and I skimmed through it. The entries were mundane at first. Notes about work, grocery lists, reminders. But the last entry caught my attention. March 15th. I keep seeing shadows in the corners of my eyes. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but now I'm certain something is here with me. I hear whispers at night calling my name. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. A chill ran down my spine. I closed the journal and decided to finish up quickly. As I was about to leave, I noticed a small door in the hallway that I hadn't opened. It was a closet, mostly empty except for a few old coats. But behind the coats, I found a trapdoor leading to a crawl spaces. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The space was dark, but I could make out something glinting in the far corner. Using my phone's flashlight, I crawled in and reached for the object. It was a small, ornate box. Inside the box were several Polaroid photos. Each photo was of a different person, standing in the very apartment I was in. They all looked distressed, and in each photo, there was a shadowy figure standing just behind them, barely visible. I felt a cold draft and heard a whisper right next to my ear. I bolted out of the crawl space, grabbed my things, and left the apartment, locking the door behind me. I called Mr. Thompson and told him I couldn't continue with the job. He didn't seem surprised. I understand, he said. You're not the first to leave abruptly. I never went back, and I never collected the payment. To this day, I wonder about the people in those photos and what might have happened to them. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear whispers calling my name. Photography has never been more than a hobby for me. Some people paint, others play instruments. I take pictures. I like capturing moments that feel empty, frozen in time. Abandoned streets at dawn, forgotten alleyways, train stations just before the last departure of the night. There's something about the stillness that's always pulled me in, like I'm documenting places the world has left behind. I never took pictures of people, not intentionally anyway. I liked my photos to feel untouched, undisturbed, free of human interference. That's why when I first noticed the man in one of my shots, I barely paid him any mind. It was a picture I had taken near the riverfront, an old cobblestone walkway lined with rusted lampposts. The sky had been a deep shade of navy, the last remnants of daylight barely clinging to the horizon. I had been focused on getting the symmetry right, the way the lampposts cast long, thin shadows stretching toward the water. It wasn't until later, when I was going through my shots, that I noticed the figure standing in the distance. He was near the edge of the frame, half hidden in the gloom beneath a flickering streetlight. A tall man, wearing a hood, his face completely obscured by shadow. His posture was off, rigid, almost unnatural, like he wasn't just passing through but standing there deliberately, watching. I remember staring at the image for a long time, feeling vaguely unsettled but ultimately brushing it off. People ended up in my photos all the time. That's just how it was in a city. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I saw him again. I had spent the day walking through different neighborhoods looking for new angles, fresh places to shoot. That night, as I uploaded the day's shots onto my laptop, something stopped me cold. There he was. Different street, different time of day, same hooded figure standing just out of focus, lingering at the edge of the frame. I felt my stomach tighten. I flipped through the images again, searching, my fingers moving faster. I found another, then another. Every few shoots, there he was. I started combing through my older photos. He was there too. Not always obvious, not always in plain sight, but once I started looking, I couldn't unsee it. Sometimes he was in the background, blending into the crowd. Other times he was more isolated, standing near an alleyway, leaning against a railing, positioned behind a tree, just far enough that only half his body was visible. The strangest part, the timeline didn't make sense. The first time I noticed him was weeks ago, but as I dug deeper, I found him in shots from months ago, different seasons, different locations. He had been following me for much longer than I had realized. That night, sleep was out of the question. I sat in my apartment, laptop open, heart pounding as I clicked through years of photos. The earliest one I found was from nearly 2 years ago. I had no explanation. Had he been tracking me all this time? Had I really been that oblivious? I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe it was a trick of the light, an odd angle making random passers-by look familiar. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This wasn't an accident. He was there on purpose. I stopped taking photos for a while. For weeks, my camera collected dust on my desk. I tried to act normal, like I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning crowds, checking reflections in windows. But paranoia settled into my bones like an illness. Then, one night, I made a mistake. I went shooting again. I told myself I just needed closure. One last night of photos to prove to myself that he wasn't really there, that my paranoia had gotten the better of me. I stuck to busy streets, well-lit areas, places with cameras and people. I avoided isolated alleyways, stayed away from quiet corners where shadows stretched too far, and for a while, it felt normal. But when I got home and plugged in my camera, there was a photo I didn't take. My breath stalled in my chest. It was blurry, poorly framed, like the lens had been lifted and clicked at random, but the subject was unmistakable. It was me, not a reflection, not a shadow. A photo taken from behind me, somewhere in the crowd while I had been taking pictures. Someone had been standing inches away from me, and I hadn't even known. Panic spread through me in icy waves. I scanned the photo for details, desperate for any clue, the angle, the location. It had been taken no more than an hour before I got home. Whoever took it had been close enough to reach out and touch me. I called the police that night, told them everything, the photos, the stranger, the realization that he had been following me for years. An officer came by, took a statement, assured me they would look into it. But I could see it in their eyes. They didn't take it seriously. No real crime had been committed. No threats, no evidence beyond my own paranoia. I installed extra locks, kept my curtains shut tight, stopped going out at night, and for a few weeks, nothing happened. Then the envelope arrived. It was slipped under my apartment door while I was sleeping. No return address, no markings, just a plain white envelope containing a single photograph. It was a picture of me, taken from inside my own apartment. I ran straight to the police station, envelope clutched in my shaking hands. This time they listened. Officers arrived at my apartment within minutes. They checked the locks, dusted for prints, reviewed security footage. And this time they found something. The cameras in my building had caught him. A man in a dark hoodie, waiting outside the entrance at 2:46 a.m. He never entered through the front. No sign of forced entry, no broken locks, but in one frame he could be seen slipping into the stairwell behind a tenant, walking straight toward my floor. They arrested him a week later. He had been watching me for over 3 years. He lived just a few blocks away, a man I had never met, never spoken to, never noticed in my daily life. But he had noticed me. The police found hundreds of photos in his apartment. Shots of me walking home, sitting in cafes, standing at crosswalks, flipping through books in stores, some from months ago, some from years ago, and some from inside my apartment while I was sleeping. They asked if I wanted to see them. I said no. I haven't picked up my camera since. Because I know I wasn't the first person he watched, and I won't be the last. I don't scare easily. That's something I've always prided myself on, working night shifts at an old office building. Most people would have quit after the first week. But I stuck with it. It's quiet, almost peaceful. The world outside goes to sleep, and I'm left to monitor empty floors and make sure everything is running smoothly. There's a strange comfort in that. No distractions, no interruptions. Just me, the security cameras, and the soft hum of the building's old machinery. At first the building seemed harmless enough, a relic from another era, old and worn down, but nothing that screamed danger. Most of the tenants had moved out years ago, leaving the space almost entirely empty. Just me and a few cleaning staff wandering the halls, but something about the silence in that place felt off. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd find in a peaceful home. It was deeper, unsettling, as though the building itself was waiting for something, or someone. It didn't take long before the odd occurrences started. Small things at first, flickering lights, a strange creak in the floorboards. I tried to brush them off, convinced it was just the building settling. But then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the halls. It wasn't loud enough to be a knock, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked the floors, checking every room, but found nothing. The tapping continued, always in the background, like a faint drum beat. For a while, I told myself it was just the pipes or the wind, but as the weeks passed, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound wasn't random. It seemed to come from a specific spot each night, a corner of the building where the lights always flickered. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the more I listened, the more the tapping felt deliberate. Someone or something was out there, and it was waiting for me to notice. One night, I decided to do something about it. I'd had enough of the tapping and the strange feeling that followed me through the halls. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, I set out to investigate the building's dark corners. The lights in the hallway flickered as I passed each room. The silence felt like a weight pressing down on me, but I kept moving. The tapping was louder now, closer. It wasn't just the pipes or the wind. There was something in the building with me. I made my way to the back of the floor, to a storage room I'd never paid much attention to. As I opened the door, the temperature dropped, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. The room was empty, but the air felt thick, as though it was holding something back. I turned the flashlight on, scanning the room. That's when I saw it, a shadow, just barely moving in the corner of the room. I froze. It was like something had been waiting for me. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I went through my routine as usual, checking the security footage, but nothing seemed out of place. No sign of the shadow I had seen. No evidence that anything had been there. I wondered if it was all just my imagination, running wild. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The building had a strange presence to it, something that made the air feel heavy. I wasn't alone there. Not really. Later that night, the whispers started. At first it was a faint rustling like a distant conversation. I thought I was hearing things, but as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder. It was as if the voices were coming from every direction, surrounding me. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was the wind or maybe even my tired mind playing tricks on me. But it didn't stop. I felt a cold presence behind me, a chill that wasn't from the building's draft. I wasn't just hearing things. Something was there with me. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the shadows. Something in the building had changed, and it was slowly driving me to the edge. I started to question my sanity. Was I losing it? Was this all in my head? I didn't know. I thought maybe I was just stressed. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me. But every night it was the same. The whispers, the tapping, the figure I couldn't quite see but could always feel. It was getting harder to ignore. That's when I received the letter from HR. It was brief, but it sent a shiver down my spine. They wanted to meet with me, to discuss something important. I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd been doing my job as usual, but the tone of the letter felt off, like they knew something I didn't. I was uneasy, but I had to go. Whatever was happening in that building, I needed answers. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. When I arrived at HR's office the next evening, the atmosphere was tense. The room was dimly lit, and the woman sitting across from me didn't say a word as I took a seat. Jay just stared at me, her expression unreadable. There was an uncomfortable silence before she slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a printout of a security camera feed from the night before. The footage showed me walking down the hallway, just as I had done countless times. But something was different this time. In the background of the footage there was a figure. It was standing still, almost hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out the details, but I knew something wasn't right. I hadn't seen anyone else in the building that night, and yet there it was. The figure, watching me. The woman in HR didn't speak for a moment, letting the weight of the footage sink in. I tried to explain myself. It must be a glitch, I said, trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone's messing with the security system. But HR wasn't buying it. They were asking questions, I didn't have answers to. Was I hearing things? Was I seeing things that weren't there? They asked me about my well-being, about how long I'd been working the night shifts. I could tell they were concerned, but I wasn't sure if it was because of the footage, or because they thought I was losing my mind. The more I thought about it, the more the doubt crept in. Could this all be in my head? Was I imagining things? I didn't know anymore. The shadow, the whispers, the figure on the footage. It all felt too real to be a trick of the mind. But then again, I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to believe I was losing touch with reality. I wanted to believe that there was something, someone else in that building, something I could confront. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the building was playing tricks on me. After the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that HR was trying to get rid of me. They didn't say it outright, but there was an underlying implication that I wasn't cut out for the job anymore. The building was getting to me, they suggested. Maybe I needed some time off, some rest. But I couldn't rest. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen and heard. The shadows, the figure on the footage. And the more I thought about it, the more the whispers came back. Louder, clearer. I wasn't imagining it. Something was happening in that building. Something I wasn't ready to understand. That night I decided I would face it head on. I couldn't keep running from whatever was in that building. I had to confront it, whatever it was. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my determination, I ventured deep into the building's lower floors. The lights flickered as I moved down the long hallway, the whispers growing louder, almost in time with my heartbeat. The tapping started again, faster this time, as if it was counting down to something. I reached the maintenance room, the one I had avoided for weeks, the one where I had first seen the shadow. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it was colder than I remembered, colder than it should have been. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old machinery, but there was something more, a sense of presence. I stepped inside and called out, my voice trembling slightly in the silence. No response. But then, I heard something. A voice, faint, but unmistakable. I stood in the maintenance room, flashlight in hand, scanning the dusty shelves and worn-down equipment. The whispers had stopped for a moment, and I took the opportunity to study my nerves. I couldn't let this building, whatever was going on, break me. I'd been through far worse, I told myself. But then, something happened. As I turned to leave, I saw a face in the reflection of the window behind me, someone staring back at me from within the glass. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty room. I shook my head, feeling a sudden wave of dizziness. I wasn't sure if it was the lack of sleep or something more sinister. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. My fingers trembled as I reached for the door handle. The room felt colder than before, and the silence felt like it was suffocating me. I stepped back into the hallway, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The lights flickered again, and I thought I saw a figure at the end of the corridor. A tall, thin man with a dark coat. I blinked, and he was gone. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of it, but the world around me seemed to blur, everything twisting and shifting like a bad dream. The next day, everything felt off. I woke up late, my alarm having failed to go off. I was disoriented, like I had just woken up from a deep sleep, although I couldn't remember falling asleep. The room was unfamiliar, and for a moment, I thought I was in a different place altogether. Then I remembered I was at home. It was a strange feeling, like the lines between my reality and the world around me were starting to blur. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was losing my grip on something, but I didn't know what. I called my friend Jake, someone I used to hang out with before all this. He was one of the few people I still kept in touch with. But when he picked up, his voice sounded distant, as if he were speaking from a faraway place. "Hey, Alex," he said, his voice low. "How's work?" I could hear the concern in his tone, but I didn't know why. "It's fine," I replied, even though I didn't feel fine. "I've just been a little off." lately. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Maybe you need to take a break, man. You've been working those night shifts too long. You're not yourself. I agreed, but the truth was I couldn't explain why I didn't feel like myself. The world around me seemed more distant than usual, like I was watching it through a fogged-up window. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't make sense of. I kept seeing flashes of faces in the dark, and the whispers had returned, not just in the building, but in my apartment too. They murmured my name, taunted me, asking if I was ready to face the truth. What truth, I didn't know. Every time I tried to sleep, I would jerk awake, convinced that I had heard someone in the next room. I would get up to check, only to find that there was no one there. But the unsettling feeling lingered. My apartment was empty, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like something was watching me. I tried to reach out to Jake again, but this time, he didn't pick up. I left him a message, but my fingers trembled as I typed. I couldn't seem to keep them steady. The next morning, I got a text from him. "Hey man, I think you should go see someone. This isn't normal. I'm worried." It stung, but I knew he was right. Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. But I didn't know who to talk to, who would believe me, who would understand what was happening to me. The line between reality and delusion had become too thin, and I was afraid of crossing it completely. That night I saw it again. The figure, the tall man in the dark coat. Only this time he was standing at the end of my bed, just beyond the foot of it. I could see his face, pale, gaunt, his eyes hollow and unblinking. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on him, unable to look away. The room was silent, save for the pounding of my heart in my ears. But when I blinked, he was gone, just like before. I sat up in bed, gasping for air, my palms sweating. I had to be dreaming. I had to be. But the cold chill in the room told me otherwise. I grabbed my phone and dialed Jake's number again, but it went straight to voicemail. I didn't know what to do anymore. The building was worse than I had realized. But it wasn't just the building. It was me. The figure, the whispers, the strange feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't real, but it was. It was real in my mind. I had spent so many nights in the dark, alone with my thoughts, that I'd lost touch with reality. I'd started to hear things, see things that weren't there. I had no idea how long it had been happening, but now I understood. I'd been in this place for too long. It wasn't just the building that was broken. It was me. I reached out to Jake once more, but this time, something was different. His voice was softer, distant, like he was saying it from far away. "Alex," he said, "I think it's time you went to see someone. I don't know how to help you anymore." I didn't want to hear it, but deep down I knew it was true. I had to face the truth. But the truth was something I wasn't ready to accept. The shadows had already taken root in my mind, and I was losing the battle. The next few days were a blur. I wasn't sure if I was sleeping or awake anymore. I would wake up in strange places, on the couch, in the kitchen, without remembering how I had gotten there. The voices wouldn't stop. They were louder now, filling my mind with thoughts I didn't recognize. Sometimes I would hear someone knocking at my door, but when I opened it, no one would be there. I started seeing figures in the corner of my vision, shadows that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew the truth. Something had broken inside me, and I didn't know how to fix it. I decided to go back to the office to see if maybe, just maybe, I could make sense of what was happening. But as I walked through the hallways, everything felt different. The building seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The whispers were louder than ever, and the figure was there, standing in the shadows, waiting. I tried to approach it, but my body wouldn't move. I was trapped in my own mind, unable to escape the reality I had built for myself. And then I realized with a cold chill that I wasn't trapped in the building at all. I was trapped inside my own mind. The walls of the office felt like they were closing in around me. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, flickering with every step I took. I couldn't tell what was real anymore, the whispers, the tapping, the figure. It all felt so vivid, like a sick game that the building had been playing with me. I had convinced myself that there was something, someone, stalking me. Something supernatural that had been following me for months, maybe even years. I had become obsessed with the idea, searching for clues, trying to find the one thing that could explain it all. But the harder I searched, the more it felt like I was spiraling into madness. I don't know what led me to the doctor's office that day, or how I even managed to get myself there. But something inside me knew I needed help. My mind was unraveling, and I couldn't fix it on my own. The diagnosis came quickly: schizophrenia. The words felt foreign, unreal, as though they belonged to someone else. But as the doctor explained, everything began to make sense. The voices I'd been hearing, the shadows in the corners of my vision, the figure I'd seen in the maintenance room. It wasn't a stalker. It wasn't a ghost. It was me, my mind, betraying me. The doctor spoke in a calm, reassuring voice. Schizophrenia is a chronic condition. It causes people to experience hallucinations, things that aren't really there, sounds that aren't real. It's not uncommon for those with schizophrenia to feel as though they're being watched, or even followed by unseen forces. I was in shock. I wanted to deny it. But deep down, I knew it was true. Everything I had experienced, everything that had plagued me for months, was a result of my mind, my fractured mind, playing tricks on me. It wasn't a ghost and it wasn't a stalker. It was a part of me, something I couldn't control. I had always prided myself on being strong, on not letting fear take hold. But now, I saw the truth. I had been fighting an enemy within myself, and I had lost. The doctor suggested therapy, medication, and taking time off work. But the idea of stopping, of confronting the reality of what was happening to me, terrified me. How had I gotten here? How had I ended up in this place where I couldn't trust my own senses? I kept thinking back to my childhood, trying to remember if there had been signs earlier on. Had something happened back then? I couldn't pinpoint it, but there were fragments of memories, strange flashes of my younger self, moments when I'd felt disconnected from reality, when I'd seen things that weren't there, heard voices that no one else could hear. I thought it was just imagination, just a phase that I would grow out of, but I hadn't. The doctor asked me about my family history. I didn't have much to go on. My parents weren't really involved in my life, and I never knew much about their past. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. When I was young, I'd been in a car accident. It wasn't a major one, but I had hit my head pretty hard. The doctors had said it was just a concussion, that there was no lasting damage. But what if that was the trigger? What if that moment, that injury, had set something off in my brain? It was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that could explain the gradual descent into madness that I had experienced over the years. I walked out of the doctor's office in a daze. The weight of the diagnosis hung heavy on my chest, and the streets felt strange beneath my feet. The world looked different now, like a distorted reflection in a broken mirror. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure of what would happen if I took another step. I wanted to go back to my apartment, to curl up in bed, and pretend like none of this was real. But I knew I couldn't. I had to face it. I had to face myself. As the days went by, the hallucinations didn't stop. But now, I understood what they were. I understood that the figure in the dark coat, the tapping, the whispers, none of it had been real. It had all been a manifestation of my mind, a product of my illness. I tried to accept it, tried to make peace with it, but it wasn't easy. I had spent so long convincing myself that something supernatural was happening to me, that I had been stalked or haunted by some unseen force. It was easier to believe in ghosts than in the terrifying reality that I was the one who had been chasing shadows all along. A few weeks later, I received a call from HR. They had heard about my diagnosis, and while they expressed concern, they offered me the opportunity to take a leave of absence. It was clear they didn't want to fire me, but they also didn't know how to handle the situation. I appreciated their offer, but I knew it was time for me to leave for good. I couldn't stay in that building, in that city, any longer. The place that had once felt so familiar had become a prison for my mind, a place where I had been trapped by my own delusions. I packed up my things and left without a word. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want to face the reality of what I had become. But as I drove away, I knew it was the right decision. I couldn't keep running from the truth. It wasn't a supernatural force that had been watching me. It wasn't some dark entity following my every move. It was me all along. And the hardest part was realizing that the only way to escape was to confront the very thing I had been trying to outrun, myself. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. Sure, I'd heard the rumors, the whispers about the Northwood dorms being haunted, about the missing student from 10 years ago, about the strange knocking sounds people claimed to hear late at night. But I figured every college had its share of urban legends. I had only been on campus for a month, settling into the routine of early classes, late-night study sessions, and cheap cafeteria food. My roommate Daniel was the opposite of me. Loud, outgoing, constantly surrounded by people. We got along well enough, though I often found myself retreating to the dorm when he went out partying. Northwood had an older, almost forgotten feel to it. The hallways were too quiet at night, the lights dimmer than they should have been, casting long, flickering shadows on the peeling walls. My dorm was on the 4th floor, one of the older wings that had barely been renovated. The room was small. The window overlooked the woods behind campus, and the radiator made strange ticking noises when the air got cold. It started with the door handle. One night, around 2 a.m., I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. The slow, deliberate turn of the knob. Not a rattle, not an accidental bump. Someone was trying to open the door. I sat up, my heart knocking against my ribs. "Daniel," I called, but I knew he wasn't back yet. He had texted me an hour ago saying he was crashing at a friend's place. The knob stilled, but I could hear breathing on the other side. Soft, measured, waiting. I reached for my phone, but as soon as my fingers brushed the screen, the sound stopped. I waited, frozen, listening. Nothing. After what felt like hours, I convinced myself it was just someone drunk trying to find their room. It was a college dorm, after all. Stupid things happened. But then I noticed something. The peephole was covered. A shiver ran down my spine. I hadn't noticed before, but now that I looked, the tiny circle was completely blacked out, like something, or someone, was standing directly in front of it, watching. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Daniel came back, oblivious, hungover, laughing about something stupid his friends had done. I wanted to tell him, but somehow, saying it out loud made it too real. I convinced myself I was overreacting. Then, a few nights later, it happened again. This time I was awake, sitting at my desk, headphones in, drowning in an essay that was due the next morning. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt coffee and stale dorm room air when I heard it. Knob turning. I ripped my headphones off. My breath caught in my throat. I turned, staring at the door. It turned again, slow, testing, and then, from beneath the door, a shadow. Not just a shadow cast by the dim hallway lights. This one moved. It stretched, creeping inward as if something was pushing itself underneath the door, seeping like smoke into the room. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then a knock. 3 soft, deliberate taps. Not from the outside. From inside my closet. I sat there, frozen, my mind scrambling for an explanation. I told myself it was my imagination, that my exhaustion was playing tricks on me, that I had misheard where the sound had come from, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. The knock had been inside the closet. Slow, Intentional. My skin prickled with cold sweat as I forced myself to turn my head toward the door. The shadow beneath it was gone, the doorknob was still, the hallway outside was silent, but my closet door, slightly ajar, just enough for darkness to seep out, felt like it was breathing. I stared at it, my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. My body screamed at me to run, but some part of me, the logical part, refused to move. This was a dorm. A normal dorm in a normal college. There was no way someone had been inside my room. No way I hadn't noticed. And yet the air felt thick with something unseen. Something watching. I stood up, slow and deliberate, my chair making the faintest scrape against the floor. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Movement, breathing, the shift of weight in the dark. Nothing. Just the distant hum of the vending machine down the hall. My fingers clenched into fists. I wasn't going to let paranoia win. This was my room, my space. I wasn't about to start jumping at shadows. I forced myself forward, one step at a time, until I was standing right in front of the closet. My own reflection stared back at me from the cheap mirror attached to the door, wide-eyed, pale. I lifted a hand, hesitated, then grabbed the handle and yanked it open. Nothing. Just the same cramped space filled with my jackets, a stack of shoeboxes, and the laundry I'd been too lazy to put away. My breath left me in a shaky exhale. Of course, there was nothing. There was never anything. I was exhausted, overworked, and psyching myself out over some stupid prank. I shut the closet, locked my dorm room for good measure, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning I woke up groggy, my limbs heavy with exhaustion. I went through my routine, barely thinking, my mind fogged over with the kind of fatigue that clings to you like a weight. I grabbed my bag and went to class, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. The campus was buzzing with its usual energy, people rushing to lectures, half-asleep students clutching coffee cups like lifelines, the distant sound of someone blasting music from their dorm window. It felt normal. But then I saw the bulletin board near the student center, a cluster of flyers pinned to the cork. My stomach twisted as my eyes landed on one in particular. Missing person. The photo was of a student, a guy around my age. Short brown hair, glasses, a familiar grin frozen in time. My brain struggled to place where I had seen him before, and then it clicked. His dorm was down the hall from mine. I didn't know him well, had only seen him in passing, but a cold chill ran through me as I read the details. Missing for 5 days. Last seen leaving the dorm late at night. No sign of forced entry in his room. No leads. A creeping unease settled into my stomach. 5 days ago, that was around the time I had started hearing the sounds at my door. When I'd first noticed the peephole was covered, I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Colleges had thousands of students. People disappeared all the time. Ran away, dropped out, left without telling anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random, that it was connected. That night I double-locked my door. I shoved my desk chair under the handle, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. It made me feel stupid, but I didn't care. Sleep came in restless waves, every creak of the old building sending a spike of anxiety through me. At some point, deep into the night, I woke up to breathing. Not mine, not Daniel's, right outside my door. Slow, shallow, like someone standing just inches away, listening. I stayed completely still, my heart racing so violently I thought it might shake the bed frame. My phone was under my pillow and I barely dared to move as I reached for it, my fingers shaking as I turned on the screen. 12 a.m. A single notification glowed at the top. Motion detected at your door. I stared at it, my mouth dry. The security app linked to the dorm's hallway cameras had picked something up. My hands fumbled as I tapped it open, my breath caught in my throat. The screen flickered, the grainy camera footage loading. My dorm door was in frame, the dim hallway stretching out in both directions. For a moment, it showed nothing. Then movement. Someone was standing right in front of my door. Not knocking, not trying to handle, just standing there. And then they bent down. I watched paralyzed as the figures slowly lowered themselves until they were eye level with the keyhole. Watching, My stomach turned to ice. They knew I was awake, and they were waiting for me to move. A cold sensation spread through my chest, like my body knew something was deeply wrong before my mind could fully process it. I gripped my phone tighter, barely breathing as I watched the screen. The figure outside my door remained crouched, completely still, just inches away from the peephole. I couldn't make out their face, only a vague silhouette in the dim hallway light. They weren't knocking, they weren't moving, just waiting. A part of me wanted to call out, to ask who it was, to break the silence. But another, much stronger instinct screamed at me to stay quiet. Whoever they were, they didn't want to be seen. They wanted to watch. The realization sent a deep electric dread through my limbs. I stayed frozen, my thumb hovering over the emergency dial on my phone. If I called someone, would they hear? Would they try to get in? And then they reached up. Slowly, deliberately, their hand lifted toward the peephole. I watched through the grainy footage, my pulse hammering against my ribs as their fingers pressed against the tiny glass circle. Covering it, the screen went black. I sucked in a sharp breath. They knew I was watching. For a long moment, nothing happened. The hallway camera remained dark, my dorm eerily silent except for the soft hum of the old radiator. I didn't move. My skin felt too tight, my body stiff with anticipation, waiting for the next sound, the next shift in the air. But it never came. After what felt like hours, I tapped the app again, refreshing the feed. When the camera flickered back to life, the hallway was empty, no sign of anyone. The peephole was clear. But something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been outside wasn't gone, that they were still nearby, listening. The air in my dorm suddenly felt heavier, the walls closing in, the silence too sharp. I had to check. I had to know. Heart pounding, I slipped out of bed and moved toward the door as quietly as I could, my bare feet making no sound against the cold floor. My hands were damp with sweat as I reached for the knob, pressing my ear against the wood, straining to hear anything beyond it. I inhaled deeply, bracing myself. Then, I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. Just the dull hum of the exit sign at the far end, the distant murmur of someone's TV behind a closed door. Nothing unusual. Except for one thing. A small, folded piece of paper lay on the ground right outside my room. I stared at it, my skin crawling with unease. It hadn't been there before. Slowly, I crouched and picked it up, unfolding it with trembling fingers. There was only one sentence scrawled across the page in uneven handwriting. I like watching you sleep. A wave of nausea rolled through me. My fingers gripped the paper so tightly it crumpled in my palm. Someone had been inside the dorm building, standing at my door, watching me. Maybe for days. I slammed the door shut, locked it, then shoved my desk chair under the handle again. My breaths were coming too fast, my mind racing through every possibility. Every time I had dismissed the strange noises, the shifts in the air, the creeping sense of being watched. This wasn't in my head, it wasn't some prank. Someone was fixated on me, and they were getting closer. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the building, every whisper of the wind against the window made my skin prickle with paranoia. I kept the dorm lights on, my back pressed against the wall, watching the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. But nothing happened. No more knocks, no more notes. Just an unbearable silence stretching through the early hours of the morning. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself to move. My limbs ached from tension, my thoughts clouded with exhaustion, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to do something. By the time I made it to campus security, my hands were still shaking. I showed them the note, explained the knocking, the covered peephole, the motion alert from my phone. The officer behind the desk listened with a concerned expression, nodding as I spoke. But when I finished, his response made my stomach twist. "We'll look into it," he said. "But there's not much we can do unless an actual crime was committed." I felt my breath catch. "What do you mean?" "Someone was outside my room in the middle of the night. They left this." I held up the crumpled paper, but he only sighed. "Look, dorms have hundreds of students. Pranks happen all the time, and unless we have footage of someone breaking in, it's not really a police matter. I stared at him, my pulse drumming in my ears. So that's it? You're just going to ignore this? We'll increase patrols in your building, he offered. If anything else happens, let us know. I wanted to scream. Instead, I grabbed the note and walked out. For the rest of the day, I tried to go about things normally, but everything felt off. I couldn't focus in class. I kept scanning the lecture hall, searching for any familiar face from the footage. Was it someone I knew? Had they been watching me all along? When I returned to my dorm that evening, my hands were slick with sweat as I unlocked the door. I braced myself for something, another note, a new sign that they'd been back. But the room was exactly as I had left it. I should have felt relieved. But I didn't. I sat on the bed, my mind churning. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. If anything, it was worse, stronger. And then, my phone buzzed. A new motion alert. I swallowed hard, my fingers hesitating before tapping the notification. The camera feed loaded, flickering slightly, and when it cleared, I stopped breathing. The hallway was empty, but the door to my dorm was slightly open. My entire body locked up. I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it. A single realization took hold, icy and paralyzing. They weren't outside anymore. They were already inside. I didn't move, didn't blink. My breath barely passed my lips as my gaze flicked toward the closet door. Just like before, it was slightly ajar. The air in the room felt suffocating, pressing down on me from all angles. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, my hands barely able to keep steady. 901, what's your emergency? I opened my mouth to speak, but before a sound could leave my throat, the closet door creaked open. The line went dead. The next thing I remember is running, sprinting down the hall, pushing past anyone in my way, my only thought getting out. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air under the cold glow of the streetlights. The police arrived within minutes. They searched my dorm, questioned my neighbors, even checked security footage. But in the end, they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no figure on the cameras, no fingerprints but my own. They suggested I might have imagined it, that I had left my door unlocked and the wind had pushed it open, but I knew better. I didn't go back. That same night, I packed my things and stayed with a friend off campus. The next morning, I put in a request for a room transfer. A week later, I moved to another dorm in a different building. For a while, nothing happened. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I was safe now. But sometimes, late at night, I would wake up with the same suffocating feeling. The sensation that someone was there, just beyond my line of sight, standing in the shadows, waiting. And a few weeks later, when I was scrolling through my phone trying to clear out my old notifications, I saw it. An unread message. No name, no number. Just a single text sent the night I fled my dorm. You were right to run. We had been hiking for hours, the trees growing denser and the trail narrowing, winding deeper into the forest. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip, a getaway from our busy lives, just the two of us, alone in the woods. But as the hours passed and the sun started to dip behind the canopy, the forest began to feel. The air grew heavy. The wind carried a chill that made me shiver despite the warmth of the day. Rachel, my girlfriend, didn't seem to notice. She was ahead of me, her light backpack swaying gently with each step. She had always been the braver one, the adventurous one. I had never really been a fan of the outdoors, but I had agreed to the trip. I figured it was time for me to try something new, and I wanted to make her happy. But now, as the daylight faded and the shadows stretched longer, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I glanced around, but all I saw were trees. Thick, silent, unfeeling trees. Then, we saw them. At first I thought they were hikers like us, just another couple or a group of friends out for a walk. They were standing in a clearing, talking among themselves in low voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but something about the way they stood in the middle of the woods, almost too still, made me uneasy. Rachel, always the social one, waved and called out a greeting. "Hey, you guys hiking too?" The strangers turned toward us, their faces expressionless. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women. Their clothes were odd, almost outdated. It was a strange mix of modern and old-fashioned, like they didn't quite belong in the present day. But their eyes, those eyes, were what unnerved me the most. They were too calm, too still. One of the men, tall with a beard and a gray jacket, smiled at Rachel's greeting, but his smile didn't seem to reach his eyes. "Yeah, we're just out for a walk," he said in a soft, monotone voice. "Where are you headed?" Rachel asked, stepping forward. "Around," the woman beside him said, her voice almost a whisper. "Around the woods." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Rachel, not sensing my discomfort, smiled brightly. "Well, we're on our way to the ridge. It's beautiful up there, perfect for watching the sunset." The strangers exchanged a brief, unreadable glance, then nodded in unison. "It sounds nice," the other man said. "Yeah," the woman added. "You should enjoy it." We stood there for a few more minutes, making small talk with them, but the longer I stayed, the more I realized something didn't feel right. Their answers were too vague, their movements too stiff. It was like they were giving me just enough to not seem odd, but not enough to make sense. Rachel was still chatting with them when I noticed it. They hadn't asked us anything. Not a single question. They didn't inquire about where we were from, what we were doing here. Nothing. It was like they didn't care who we were or why we were out here in the woods. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they started to turn and walk away, moving in the same strange, synchronized way. "Take care," one of them called back without looking over their shoulder. We watched them disappear into the trees, their movements eerily smooth. After they were gone, Rachel turned to me, still smiling. They were nice. I didn't know how to answer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. "They were strange," I said, trying to sound casual. She laughed and patted my arm. "You're overthinking it. They were probably just out for a peaceful hike like us." I nodded, but I didn't feel any better. The deeper we went into the woods, the more I felt eyes on me, as if the trees themselves were watching. Then, about an hour later, it happened. We heard footsteps behind us. At first I thought it was another hiker, maybe someone passing by, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. I shook it off. Just my imagination, I told myself. But then it happened again. A faint rustling of leaves, the sound of something moving behind us. I looked at Rachel, but she hadn't noticed. She was too focused on the trail ahead. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. "Hear what?" she asked, glancing at me with a smile. "I think someone's following us," I said, my heart pounding. Rachel stopped walking and turned around, but there was no one there. "Stop freaking out," she said, laughing softly. "You're just paranoid." I wanted to believe her, I really did. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the feeling. I had been hiking for long enough to know when something was off, and something was definitely wrong. As the sun finally set, we decided to head back to the campsite. I was relieved to finally be heading in the right direction. But that's when it happened again. The sound of footsteps. I turned around quickly, my stomach dropping. There, standing in the fading light, were the 4 strangers. They weren't running, they weren't shouting, they were just standing there, watching us. I grabbed Rachel's arm. "We need to go, now." But as we turned to leave, I noticed something terrifying. No matter how fast we walked, the strangers were always just behind us. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, but it was too much to ignore. Each time I glanced back, they were there, walking at the same steady pace. No matter how fast we moved, they kept a perfect distance, never rushing, never running, but never falling behind either. We picked up the pace. I started to jog. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Something in my gut told me if we did, they would hear it. But they didn't move any faster. They just kept following, as silent and as still as shadows. We finally reached the edge of the woods near the parking lot, and I turned one last time. The strangers were still there, standing at the tree line, watching us. They didn't approach, they didn't say a word, they just stood there, silent, unwavering. I didn't know if we were ever going to get away. We got in the car and left without looking back. I didn't care if I was being paranoid anymore. All I knew was that the feeling of being followed wouldn't leave me, and I couldn't shake the thought that they were still out there, watching. The next day we packed up and left the area. We didn't talk much on the way back to the city, both of us silently processing the strange encounter. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Those unblinking eyes, watching from the trees, never moving closer but always just behind us. I couldn't help but feel they had been more than just hikers. Something about their perfect calm, their synchronized movements, didn't sit right. And the worst part, they didn't need to chase us. They were always just one step behind. We didn't speak much on the drive home, both of us lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened. The evening had turned from a peaceful hike into something far more sinister. As we got closer to the city, I thought I'd finally be able to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But it lingered. The air in the car felt heavier, the road seemed darker. Every turn I took, every passing street light felt like it was closing in on me. Rachel was quiet, her face pale in the dim light, and I could tell she was replaying the same events over and over in her mind. That we had both been unsettled by the strangers, but I couldn't tell if it was just fear or something worse that was making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I turned onto the highway, the headlights flickered for a brief moment, and I slammed on the brakes instinctively. The car jolted to a stop, and I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding. Rachel's voice broke the silence, her tone more nervous than usual. "Did you see that?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously out the window. I blinked and looked around. There was nothing unusual about the road, just empty fields and the occasional passing car. "See what?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor in it. "Back there," she insisted, "in the trees. It looked like one of them, one of the people from the woods." I looked at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying. It was impossible. We were miles away from the forest now. I shook my head. "Rachel, it's just your mind playing tricks on you. We're fine." But even as I said the words, I felt the discomfort creeping back in, like something was still out there. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that we weren't alone. The sensation that we were being watched had returned, only this time it was even more intense. Every reflection in the rearview mirror felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. I kept glancing back, but there was nothing, just the dark highway behind us. When we finally arrived at the apartment, I thought I'd be able to breathe again. We had made it back to safety, away from the woods, away from the strangers. But as I got out of the car, I noticed something strange. The hairs on my neck stood up again. A set of footprints, wet, muddy, and fresh, led from the entrance of our building, disappearing around the corner of the parking lot. It couldn't be. I froze. Rachel had already gone inside, but I stood there for a moment staring at the footprints. They led toward the entrance where we'd parked earlier, but then they turned. They veered off toward the side of the building. I felt my stomach twist. The only explanation that made sense was that someone had followed us here, someone who had been with us in the woods. The strangers. But how had they gotten here so quickly? How had they known exactly where we were going? Later that night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, scratching sounds at the door, soft thuds against the walls, the feeling of something watching me from the dark corners of the room. I kept checking the windows, locking and unlocking the door, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. My thoughts kept returning to the footprints. Had they been here? Had they watched us come in? Rachel was asleep, oblivious to the sense of dread that had taken over me. I felt paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the strangers were still with us, silently waiting for the right moment. I decided to check the balcony. The apartment was on the second floor, so there was no reason anyone could easily get up there. But I had to make sure. As I walked to the sliding door, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the darkness outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, standing motionless at the edge of the parking lot, looking up at the apartment. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was dressed in dark clothes, just like the strangers from the woods. I couldn't make out their face, but their posture was eerily familiar, still, unnervingly still. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. I woke Rachel and told her we needed to leave, but she refused. She didn't believe me. "You're just freaking out," she said, rubbing her eyes. "We're home now. It's over." But as much as I tried to calm myself, the presence outside felt real. I was convinced the strangers had followed us here. Even if they hadn't come inside, their presence loomed over us. I stayed up the rest of the night, jumping at every creak of the building, every sound that echoed in the darkness. And in the morning, when I checked the balcony again, there were no signs of anyone being there. But I knew what I'd seen. The next few days were a blur. I tried to put the whole thing behind me, tried to tell myself it was nothing more than paranoia, but I couldn't escape the feeling that they were still out there. Rachel and I started to notice things, little things that didn't add up. We found our front door slightly ajar in the mornings, the living room lights on when we were sure we'd turned them off. And one night, as I walked down the hallway, I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper from the dark, like someone was standing just beyond the shadows, watching. I couldn't shake the thought that the strangers had never truly left us. Their calm, silent presence had followed us back into our lives, and no matter how far we ran, no matter how much we tried to escape the woods, they would always be one step behind. Days turned into weeks, but the unsettling feeling of being watched never truly left. Rachel and I tried to move on, to resume our lives, but something had shifted within me. The woods, the strangers, the ever-present feeling of being followed. It haunted me. It wasn't just paranoia. It was as if they were still there, lurking in the background, waiting. I couldn't shake it. I started doing some research online, looking up anything that might explain the strange events, but nothing I found felt right. No reports of missing hikers, no strange occurrences in the area, nothing that could explain what we had experienced. I even looked up the strange figures from the woods, but there was nothing, no trace of them online. It was as if they didn't exist. But the more I searched, the more I found myself spiraling. I became obsessed. I checked the locks, the windows, every corner of the apartment. I started carrying a pocket knife with me, convinced that one of those strangers would find a way inside. Every night I checked the parking lot from the balcony, peering into the shadows, waiting for them to appear. But they never did. One night as I was sitting on the balcony, staring into the night, I heard a faint noise behind me. I froze. I didn't need to turn around. I knew it was Rachel, but something in my gut told me not to acknowledge her. I kept my eyes trained on the parking lot, but from the corner of my vision, I saw her step into the living room. She'd been quiet lately, ever since I started obsessing over the events. I could see the concern on her face, but also something else. Exhaustion. She walked over to me and sat down beside me, her voice soft as she spoke. "You need to let it go, you know." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind kept racing, my thoughts tangled in knots. "Look," she continued, her voice full of gentle frustration. "I know you're scared, but this..." She paused as if choosing her words carefully. "This isn't helping us. We're fine. We're safe." Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. Instead, they made me feel like I was losing control of something deeper. That night, after Rachel fell asleep, I couldn't help myself. I grabbed my keys and decided to go for a drive. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get out of the apartment. The darkness of the city streets felt like a better alternative than the quiet of the apartment that had begun to feel too small. As I drove, I found myself heading back toward the woods. The familiar feeling of unease settled in my stomach, but this time, I didn't turn back. I parked near the trailhead, unsure why I'd come back here, but feeling a strange sense of closure that I hadn't felt in weeks. I walked down the trail, the soft crunch of leaves beneath my feet the only sound in the dead of night. The forest was silent, just like it had been the first time we walked through it. For a long time I stood there, breathing in the cold air, waiting. But nothing happened. The strange figures didn't appear. The oppressive feeling of being followed didn't return. I had come here expecting to see them, expecting to confront my fear, but there was only quiet. I realized then what I had been afraid of all this time. It wasn't the strangers or their silent pursuit. It wasn't the fear of being chased or watched. What had terrified me was the idea that I couldn't escape my own mind. The anxiety, the paranoia, the constant wondering if I was truly losing touch with reality. But standing there in the woods, I realized something important. They had never been following me. I had been following them. They had always been one step behind. Not because they were hunting me, but because I was the one who couldn't let go of them. My mind had twisted the experience into something darker than it ever was, building it up until it felt like a constant presence in my life. But in the end, they had never shown any aggression, never made a move against me. They were just people, strange, yes, but not a threat. And that realization was all I needed. I went home, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Rachel was still asleep when I returned, her soft breathing the only sound in the apartment. I quietly crawled into bed beside her, feeling the tension slowly drain from my body. The next morning I felt different, calmer. I knew it would take time to truly let go of the fear, but I had faced it head on, and that was enough. The strangers, the woods, the paranoia. It was all part of the journey, but it wasn't something I would let control me anymore. We didn't go back to the woods. I didn't feel the need to. But for the first time since that strange encounter, I felt at peace. The lingering fear had faded into the past. Sometimes, the only thing that follows you is the fear you hold on to. And in the end, it's up to you whether or not you let it define you.